The wedding cake was still on the table when Sarah Adayeze understood that her life had just been divided into two halves, before tonight and everything that would come after. She had not cried during the ceremony, not when the gold ring was slid onto her finger, not when the guests stood and applauded in that polished ballroom with the chandeliers throwing light across 200 faces she barely knew, not even when Damien Cole stood beside her at the altar and looked at the priest instead of her, with an expression that had all the warmth of a man reading a contract he had already decided to sign. Sarah had smiled. She had said her vows clearly. She had held her bouquet of white lilies without crushing them. She had done every single thing a bride was supposed to do. It was only now, standing at the window of the bridal suite on the 14th floor of the Ashford Grand Hotel, that she let herself feel the weight of the day pressing down on her shoulders like stone. The room behind her was beautiful, cream walls, fresh roses on the bedside tables, a champagne bottle in a silver bucket that nobody had opened. The dress she wore had been her grandmother's, taken in at the waist by Sarah's own hands over 3 evenings of careful stitching, because her grandmother had been a larger woman, and Sarah had inherited only her stubbornness and her land. She heard Damien come out of the bathroom. She heard the sound of his watch being set on the glass surface of the dressing table. She heard him sit on the edge of the bed. She did not turn around. He said her name once. Just once, the way people say the name of something they are about to put down. She turned. He was still in his wedding shirt, the top button open, his tie loosened. He was looking at her with something she could not immediately name, not anger, not cruelty. Something flatter than both of those things, which turned out to be far worse. He said, "I need to be honest with you." She waited. He said, "I don't want you." The words arrived in the room and stayed there, taking up space. He said it without raising his voice. He said it the way a person states weather, or a fact from a newspaper. Something that has been true before the conversation started and will remain true after it ends. He told her that the marriage had been her father's arrangement, that he had agreed because of obligations she would not understand, that he had no intention of pretending this was something it was not. He told her she was welcome to the room, and that he would sleep on the sofa in the sitting area, or she could. It was her choice. He said he was sorry. He did not sound it. Sarah stood very still. She thought about 12 things simultaneously. She thought about the lace of her grandmother's dress and the 3 evenings she had spent at the sewing table. She thought about her father, who was downstairs at the reception dinner right now, laughing at something someone said, with the satisfied expression of a man who had closed a deal. She thought about the 200 guests who had eaten and toasted and taken photographs. She thought about the fact that Damien Cole was 34 years old and had the kind of face that made women do things they would later have to explain to their friends, and that this face was looking at her right now with the polite indifference of a hotel receptionist. She thought about all of this. Then she picked up her small evening purse from the dresser, walked past him to the sitting room door, opened it, and went in. She did not slam the door. She closed it quietly, the way you close a door when you have made a decision. She sat on the sofa in the sitting room of the bridal suite of the Ashford Grand Hotel in her grandmother's altered wedding dress, and in the silence, she made a list, not on paper, in her head, where it was safer. She had been taught to make lists by her grandmother, a woman named Patience Adayeze, who had lived 81 years with the particular brand of ferocity that quiet women sometimes carry. Her grandmother had owned a piece of land on the eastern edge of the city, 12 acres of it, clean titled, no debt, passed through 3 generations of women in their family. Land that had never been sold. Land that Patience had designed a community building for, once, sketching it out on graph paper over many weekends. A building that would house a library and a health clinic and a small market, though she had never had the money to build it. That land belonged to Sarah. It had come to her the year her grandmother died, when Sarah was 26 and working as a junior accountant at a logistics firm, and she had held the title in a folder in her apartment and thought about it the way you think about something precious that you are not yet ready to use. It belonged to her. She held that thought in the sitting room of the bridal suite and let it steady her. Then she put her head back against the sofa cushion and went to sleep in her wedding dress, because she was tired and because there was nothing else to do tonight. In the morning she woke before him. She showered, changed into the travel clothes she had packed in her overnight bag, and ordered room service for 1, coffee, toast, fruit, which she ate sitting at the small table by the sitting room window, watching the city below begin its day. When she heard him moving in the bedroom, she finished her coffee, left the tray where it was, and went downstairs to where a car was waiting to take her to the house that was now, technically, hers to share with him. The house was in Kensington Lane, a wide, quiet street of large detached homes behind gates and old trees. She had visited once, before the wedding, A brief walkthrough with a woman named Carol, who managed the property, and who had described the rooms in the efficient language of someone who preferred things over people. 5 bedrooms, 3 reception rooms, a kitchen that ran the full length of the back of the house, a garden, a garage with 2 cars Sarah had not been asked about. She arrived before Damien did, because he had stayed at the hotel for reasons he did not share. Carol was there to hand over the keys. Sarah thanked her and walked through the house alone, which was how she preferred it. She walked slowly. She opened every door. She looked at every room. She found the study with the full set of bookshelves and the wide oak desk and decided it would be hers. She found the guest suite at the end of the east corridor, large, south-facing, a window that looked over the garden, and decided that would be her room. Not the master suite which adjoined Damien's room through a shared dressing room, her own room, with its own lock, at the other end of the corridor. She put her overnight bag on the bed in the guest suite. She stood at the window and looked at the garden, which needed no work and was clearly maintained by someone who knew what they were doing. There was a cherry tree near the far wall just beginning to lose its spring blossom, and the petals were falling in slow, unhurried drifts. Downstairs, she heard a car pull into the drive. She did not go down. She unpacked her bag methodically, hanging the 2 items that needed hanging, placing her books on the windowsill, setting her phone to charge on the bedside table. She heard the front door. She heard footsteps in the entrance hall below, then in the kitchen, then on the stairs. He passed her door without stopping. She had not expected him to stop, and she was not disappointed that he did not. She was simply noting information. She was, as her grandmother had always told her, paying attention. She paid attention for the next several days with the specific patience of someone who already knows the game is longer than the other player thinks it is. She observed the household. There were 4 staff: Carol, who managed the house and scheduled everything, a cook named Henry who arrived at 7 in the morning and left at 3 in the afternoon, a cleaner named Bev who came Tuesdays and Fridays, and a driver named Phil who was technically Damien's but who was available to Sarah if she requested in advance. She learned their rhythms. She learned what they knew, and what they thought about what they knew, and what they chose not to say. She did this through simple conversation over coffee, and through the kind of listening that most people mistake for niceness. She learned that Bev had worked in the house for 4 years and had left a previous job with the Cole family's mother, Celestine, because of a disagreement she described only as difficult management style. She learned that Henry had been hired through an agency that Celestine also used, which meant Henry reported informally on what the household ate and who visited. She learned that Carol managed 3 other properties for the Cole family, which meant her first loyalty was institutional, not personal. She learned that Damien left the house at 7:15 most mornings and returned between 8 and 10 in the evening, that he had dinner either out or at his desk, that he received 2 personal phone calls every evening, one at around 7 and one later, that he had not, since her arrival, come down for breakfast at the same time as her, though this might have been coincidence. She did not think it was coincidence. She also began, very quietly, to learn the financial structure of the Cole household and the Cole family businesses. This was easier than people might expect, because Sarah was an accountant by training, and because people leave documents in obvious places when they believe their wife is merely decorating the background of their life. She found quarterly reports in the study bookshelf. She found shareholder circulars in the recycling bin, not yet collected. She found a property portfolio summary in a folder labeled Miscellaneous in the lower drawer of the oak desk, which she had by now established was hers. Damien had not once entered the study since she moved in, which told her either that he had another office space, or that he considered it her territory by some unspoken rule she chose not to examine. She read everything carefully. She remembered everything she read. She kept none of it in writing. At the end of the 3rd week she went to the kitchen at 6:30 in the evening, when Henry had already left, and made herself dinner. She was standing at the stove when she heard the front door, and then footsteps, and then Damien appeared in the kitchen doorway in his work clothes, jacket off, looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. He said, "I didn't know you cooked." She said, "There are many things you don't know." She said it pleasantly. She put 2 plates on the counter because she had made enough for 2 without thinking about it, which she considered a reflex she would need to examine later, and she served both plates and sat at the kitchen island and began to eat. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he came in and sat across from her and ate without speaking, and she let the silence be there between them because she had learned from her grandmother that silence is a language too, and you have to know when to use it and when to step into it, and when to let the other person drown in it a little. When he finished, he said, "It's good." She said, "I know." He almost smiled. She saw it at the corner of his mouth before he recovered it. He put his plate in the sink and went back upstairs. She finished eating. She thought about what was under the surface of the documents she had been reading. She thought about the land her grandmother had left her. She thought about the fact that she had been married for 3 weeks and had not once been asked what she wanted, or needed, or thought about anything. She was not sad about this. Sad was for people who were surprised. She was something else entirely. She was the woman her grandmother had raised, which meant she was patient, and she was watching, and she was already 2 or 3 moves ahead of where this conversation appeared to be taking place. She washed both plates. She went upstairs and sat at the desk in the study and began to make some calls. The first call she made was to a woman named Grace, who had been her closest friend since university, and who was now a solicitor specializing in property law. She did not call from her regular phone. She used the old handset she had brought with her in a separate bag, and which Damien did not know existed, because Sarah had learned at 22 that the most important conversations you ever have are the ones nobody else knows are happening. She told Grace she needed some background information. She described the land her grandmother had left her, its location, its title registration number, its history. She asked Grace to run a search, just to confirm the title was still registered in Sarah's name. Grace said she would do it in the morning and call back. Sarah said thank you, put the phone in the desk drawer, and sat in the quiet of the study for a long time, not reading, not writing, just sitting. Somewhere outside the cherry tree was losing the last of its blossoms. She listened to the house breathe around her. She heard Damien's footsteps above. The bedroom was directly over the study, and then the sound of a door, and then quiet. She had not cried since the night in the bridal suite. She would not cry now. She had made a list, and she was working through it, and there was nothing on the list that required tears. Her grandmother had told her once, at the kitchen table in the house on Merton Road where Sarah had spent most of her childhood, that the difference between a woman who is ruined by difficulty and a woman who is made by it has nothing to do with strength. It has to do with attention, her grandmother said. Pay attention. Don't react to what is visible. React to what is real. Sarah had been 14 when she heard that. She had not fully understood it then. She understood it now. She closed the desk drawer. She turned off the lamp. She went to bed in her room at the end of the east corridor, and she slept the particular sleep of someone who has made a decision and is at peace with it, even before she knows how it will end. Outside, the city went on doing what cities do, loud and indifferent and full of people living lives in parallel to hers, none of them knowing or caring that in a house on Kensington Lane a woman was lying in the dark with 12 acres of land in her chest like a compass, waiting to see which direction the needle would point. Grace called back on a Wednesday morning, 4 days after Sarah had asked her to run the search. Sarah was in the garden when the phone rang, sitting on the wooden bench under the cherry tree with a cup of tea she had made herself because Henry didn't arrive until 7, and Sarah was always awake before that. The morning was gray and cool, the way April mornings in the city often are, with a sky the color of unread mail. She picked up on the second ring. Grace said, "I found something, and I need you to listen carefully." Sarah set down her tea. Grace was not a woman who used words like carefully without reason. They had been friends for 11 years, and in 11 years, Sarah had never heard Grace begin a phone call with a warning. Grace was the kind of person who led with information, laid it out in clean, orderly rows, and let you arrange your own feelings around it. So when she said listen carefully, Sarah straightened her back and put one hand flat on her knee, a small physical act of steadying herself that her grandmother had taught her, without ever knowing she was teaching it. Grace told her the land title had been transferred. The words arrived like something cold dropped into warm water, slow at first, then spreading everywhere. The title for the 12 acres on the eastern edge of the city, Patience Adeyeze's land, 3 generations of women's land, had been transferred out of Sarah's name 11 days before the wedding. The receiving entity was a private property company called Meridian Holdings. The transfer documents bore Sarah's signature. Sarah said, "I didn't sign any transfer." Grace said, "I know you didn't, but there's a document on file that says you did." Sarah thought about this for a moment. Then she thought about the stack of papers her father had given her 6 weeks before the wedding. Prenuptial asset declarations, he had called them. Standard procedure for a marriage of this kind. He had told her to sign at the flag tabs, and she had done it because she had been focused on other things. On her dress, on the arrangements, on trying to understand why she was marrying a man who had never once looked at her the way a man looks at a woman he has chosen. She had signed at the flag tabs. She had not read every page. She set the phone on her knee for one moment, looked at the gray sky above the cherry tree, and breathed in exactly the way her grandmother had shown her, slowly, through the nose, until she felt the ground under her feet even though she was sitting down. Then she put the phone back to her ear and said, What are our options? Grace said there was a 12-month window to challenge a transfer made under what the law called vitiating conditions, meaning if the signing party did not have full and clear information about what they were signing, and if the transfer was structured in a way that obscured its nature among other documents, it could be challenged as invalid. The window started from the date of transfer, which meant Sarah had approximately 11 months and 19 days. She said, "Can you take this on?" Grace said, "I already am." They arranged to meet Thursday at Grace's office. Sarah put the phone back in the desk drawer, finished her cold tea in the garden, and then went inside and stood at the kitchen window for a long time, looking at nothing in particular, while the machinery of her mind worked through what she had just been told. Her father had taken her land. He had done it quietly, with a pen and a stack of papers and a daughter who trusted him enough not to read every page. He had taken 12 acres that her grandmother had owned and protected through decades of difficulty, and he had handed it to a company whose name she did not yet know the meaning of. She thought about him at the reception dinner, laughing at the bottom of the champagne glass. She thought about every conversation she had ever had with him about her grandmother's land, how he had always said things like, "One day you'll develop it properly," and, "It's sitting there doing nothing, Sarah," with a tone she had mistaken for impatience when it was in fact something else entirely. She thought about Meridian Holdings. Then she went to the study and sat at the desk and began to search. Meridian Holdings was a private company. Its registered office was in the city. Its director, listed on the public register, was a man named Owen Barker, who did not appear in any social media, any news archive, or any industry publication. A ghost director, a front. She searched deeper. She cross-referenced Meridian Holdings against the Cole family business structure, which she had been quietly piecing together from the quarterly reports and shareholder circulars she had found. It took her 2 hours. She found it. Meridian Holdings had received seed investment from a parent vehicle called CF Capital Partners. CF Capital's beneficial ownership, buried under 2 layers of nominee structures, pointed to an individual investor whose initials appeared repeatedly in the correspondence records she had found in the recycling bin. CFC, 3 letters. Celestine Florence Cole, Damien's mother. Sarah sat back in the chair. The room was quiet. Outside, she could hear Henry arriving through the back gate, the sound of the kitchen door, the particular rhythm of a person who has entered a space many times and is comfortable in it. She thought about this new information and what it changed and what it confirmed. What it changed. Everything she had believed about who was in control of this situation. What it confirmed. What she had felt, beneath the surface of things, since the night in the bridal suite. That she was not a wife, that she was a position in a transaction, that the marriage itself was an instrument, not an end. And this was important, because it meant Damien might not have known, or he might have known exactly. And she did not yet know which was true, and she needed to know, because the 2 possibilities required completely different responses. She was still thinking about this when the study door opened. She had not heard him come downstairs. He was in his work clothes, jacket on, ready to leave. He looked at her with the expression she had by now catalogued as his default in her presence. Not unkind, not warm, simply the face of a man who does not know what to do with a thing he has placed in a room and not examined. He said, "You're up early." She said, "I usually am." He said, "What are you working on?" She said, "Accounts." Which was true enough. She was an accountant. The accounts she was working on happened to be his family's, but that was a level of precision she was not yet ready to share. He nodded. He left. She listened to the front door, and then the car, and then silence. On Thursday, she met Grace at the office on Fletcher Street, a small and extremely well-organized space above a pharmacy, with 2 good chairs and a window that looked at the street below, and a degree on the wall from a university that did not give out degrees to people who were not serious. Grace laid out the strategy in 40 minutes. She had already done the preliminary research. She had a timeline, a list of documents needed, and a projected cost, which Sarah reviewed without expression and then agreed to. Then Grace said, "Does your husband know about this?" Sarah said, "No." Grace said, "Do you think he's involved?" Sarah considered the question the way she considered everything, not quickly, not lazily, but with the kind of genuine attention that looks from the outside like slowness, and is in fact the opposite. She said, "I don't know yet." Grace said, "Does it change anything, strategically?" Sarah said, "Not the legal part, the rest, yes." She went home. She did not tell Damien she had been out. He did not ask. He arrived at 8:45 that evening, which was earlier than usual, and came into the kitchen while she was there, and she noticed that he looked tired in a specific way. Not sleep tired, but pressured tired. The face of a person who has been in rooms where things were required of him for too many hours. She had made enough food for two again. This time she noticed it before it happened and made the decision consciously, rather than blaming it on reflex. She set 2 plates. He sat down. He ate. He did not say thank you until he was finished, and when he did, it was with a directness that caught her off guard. Not polite, but real, as if it had cost him something to say it. She said, "You're welcome." He said, "I know I haven't been." She waited. He stopped, started again. He said, "This isn't what I wanted for you." She looked at him. She had learned in 11 years of friendship with Grace that silence after a partial sentence is always more useful than filling it. He said, "My mother arranged this." "You probably know that." She said, "I suspected." He said, "I want you to know I'm not." He stopped again. Whatever he was going to say, it was not coming easily. She could see it moving under the surface of his face like something that had not yet found the right door. He said, "I'm not a bad person." She thought about that. She thought about what it meant to say that sentence, whether it was a defense or a plea or simply a statement someone makes when they are not sure it is true. She said, "I don't know what you are yet." It came out without cruelty. It was simply the truth, said in the same register she used for everything else, and it landed on the table between them with a weight that was not aggressive and was also not comfortable. He looked at her, really looked at her, the way he had not done at the altar, the way he had not done in the bridal suite, the way she had begun to believe he was perhaps not capable of. His eyes were dark brown, the kind that look almost black in certain light, and they were doing something she could not immediately read, which was unusual for her. Then he said, "That's fair." He got up, put his plate in the sink and left the kitchen. She sat for a moment. Then she wrote down, in the notebook she kept for grocery lists and nothing else, one single word, which was not a grocery item but which she wanted to remember the feeling of in this exact moment, so she could return to it later when she needed to remember what it was she was working with. The word was, possible. She closed the notebook. She went upstairs. She did not know yet if Damien had known about the land. She did not know if possible meant what she thought it meant, or if it was wishful thinking dressed up as analysis. What she knew was this. The 12-month window had 11 months and 15 days left. She had a solicitor and a strategy and a desk and a study that had become entirely hers. She had the habits of attention her grandmother had built into her from the age of 14, which were, she was increasingly convinced, worth more than anything else she had been given. She went to her room at the end of the east corridor and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the wall for a while. Then she got her phone and texted Grace. "Find out who Owen Barker actually is." Grace replied 3 minutes later with a single word, "Already." Sarah put the phone down. She thought about her grandmother's land, 12 acres of it, sitting on the eastern edge of the city, waiting. She thought about the graph paper plans in her grandmother's handwriting, still in the folder with the original title documents, which she had kept in a lockbox in her apartment before the move, and which she had brought with her to this house in a bag she had not yet unpacked, because she was not yet ready. She was almost ready. She put her hand on the locked suitcase under the bed. Just for a moment. The way you put your hand on a wall to confirm it is there. It was there. She went to sleep. The following Tuesday, Sarah asked to speak with Carol. She found her in the utility room off the kitchen, organizing the household accounts, which Sarah had not previously been shown, because nobody had thought to show her, because nobody had thought to ask whether she might be interested in the financial management of the household she now lived in. Sarah said, "I'd like to go through these with you." Carol looked at her with the expression of someone who is calculating several things simultaneously. She was a woman in her early 50s, neat and efficient, with the particular composure of someone who has worked for difficult families for long enough to have learned not to be surprised by anything. She said, "Mr. Cole hasn't asked me to include you in." Sarah said, "I'm not asking Mr. Cole's permission. This is my home." It came out quietly, without heat, with exactly as much force as was required. Carol looked at her again. Something shifted. Sarah recognized the shift. It was the moment a person recalibrates who they are actually dealing with. Carol pulled out the folder and placed it on the counter. They spent 2 hours going through it together. Sarah asked questions. She noted figures. She identified 3 vendor accounts that were inflated, 1 cleaning service that was billed monthly but only attended the property every 6 weeks, and a property management fee that Carol was passing on wholesale from the main Cole estate account without any renegotiation, which was costing approximately £11,000 a year more than necessary. She said, "I'd like to take over the household accounts." Carol said, "I would need to." Sarah said, I understand you'll need to inform Damien. That's appropriate. Please do. Carol nodded. Her expression had completed its recalibration. She was now looking at Sarah the way people look at things that are more substantial than they first appeared. 2 days later, Damien knocked on the study door. Sarah was at the desk. She said, come in. He came in, looked at the room, which had, in the weeks since she'd moved in, become entirely organized to her preferences, with her books, her papers, her reading lamp at the correct angle, and said, Carol tells me you want to manage the household budget. Sarah said, yes. He said, you're an accountant. She said, I am. He said, fine. And he left. She did not smile until the door was closed. The smile was small and private and had nothing to do with the household accounts. It had to do with the distance between the word fine and everything it cost him to say it easily. The next morning she called the cleaning service and renegotiated the contract herself. She called the property management company and began what would turn out to be a 3-conversation process of bringing the fee down to market rate. She canceled the inflated vendor and found a replacement in an afternoon. Henry came into the study with coffee at 10 and put it on the edge of the desk the way he always did, politely, with a small nod, and then paused, which was not what he always did. He said, Are you changing the household accounts? She said, I am. He said, The previous account managed the shopping order through a company on the north side. I've always thought it was overpriced. She said, What would you use instead? He told her. She wrote it down. She thanked him. He nodded and left. She understood what had just happened. Henry had been watching her for weeks, measuring her the way household staff always measure the people they work for, trying to determine whether she was someone worth investing in, whether the information she received would be used or ignored, whether her requests would be consistent, whether she was a person who kept her word in small things. He had decided she was worth it. He had made his first offering, the supplier information, which was not just useful in itself but was a signal, a flag in the ground. She filed it accordingly. By the end of her 6th week in the house on Kensington Lane, 3 things had happened that nobody had announced, but everybody in the household had noticed. The household budget was under her management. The supplier contracts had been renegotiated, and the informational flow in the house had quietly, without drama, begun to run through her. Damien's mother called on a Friday evening. Sarah was in the kitchen when she heard his voice in the hallway, low and careful in the particular way he was only when speaking to Celestine. She did not listen to the call. She did not need to. She could read the shape of it and how he came into the kitchen afterward, the set of his shoulders, the way he poured water instead of the drink she could see he wanted. She said, Is everything all right? He said, My mother wants to have dinner on Sunday, all of us. Sarah said, All right. He looked at her, expecting something, resistance perhaps, or anxiety, or the kind of careful social performance that people put on before an important meeting. She gave him none of these things. She simply went back to what she was doing. He stood in the kitchen for a moment longer than necessary. Then he went upstairs. Sunday dinner at Celestine Cole's house was, Sarah understood from the moment she walked in, a performance. The dining room was too large for comfort and too formal for family, with a table that could seat 14 and on this evening seated 7. Celestine at the head, Damien beside Sarah in the middle, 2 cousins whose names Sarah was told and immediately stored. Celestine's brother, a man named Douglas who had the particular quiet of someone who has spent years observing a powerful person close up and has learned to take up as little space as possible. And Celestine's oldest friend, a woman named Patricia who was there, Sarah assessed, to serve as an audience and a witness. Celestine was a beautiful woman in her early 60s, with the kind of bone structure that photographs well and the kind of warmth that is displayed without ever being given. She greeted Sarah at the door with both hands clasped around hers, and said how lovely, and how we've been wanting to get to know you properly, and smiled with her whole face. Sarah smiled back with her whole face. It was one of the more comfortable lies she had told in recent weeks. The meal was excellent. The conversation was careful. Celestine directed it with the ease of someone who had been directing rooms since she was old enough to understand that rooms could be directed. She asked Sarah about her family, with a particular emphasis on her parents, her father especially. And Sarah answered with a warmth that was real enough to be convincing, and brief enough to give away nothing. She asked Sarah about her work, and Sarah said she was between positions since the move, which was true, and that she was considering some consulting work, which was also true. And Celestine said how wonderful, in a tone that meant she had already categorized Sarah as someone whose professional life was a hobby rather than a vocation. Sarah noted this categorization. She did not correct it. It was Douglas. Quiet, marginal Douglas, who gave her the most useful thing of the evening. He was seated across from her, and in a gap between main course and dessert, while Celestine was managing some small performance at the other end of the table. He leaned slightly forward and said, as if continuing a conversation they had already been having, "I knew your grandmother, you know." Sarah looked at him. He said, "Patience. I knew her through a community council in the 90s, a formidable woman." Sarah said, "She was." He said, "She had plans for that land of hers, East Side. Did she ever build?" Sarah said, "She never had the capital." He said, "Shame. She'd drawn the whole thing out, hadn't she? Library, clinic." Sarah said, "She had." He said, "It's still there, is it, that land?" He asked it lightly, the way a person asks about something they are already confident of the answer to. The way someone asks when what they really want is to see your face when you answer. Sarah looked at him for one held moment. She said, "Of course. Why wouldn't it be?" He met her eyes and then looked away at his dessert spoon, and she read in that look something she would think about for the rest of the evening. That Douglas knew about the land, that he had asked the question to see if she knew, and that when she answered without flinching, he had concluded something. She was not sure yet whether he concluded something for her or against her. She thought about it all the way home in the car, sitting beside Damien in the dark, the city moving past the windows, both of them quiet. Damien said, without looking at her, "What did you and Douglas talk about?" She said, "My grandmother." He said nothing. She said, "Did you know him well, growing up?" He said, "He's always been around. He's careful." She said, "Careful of what?" He said, "Of my mother." It was the most direct thing he had said to her about his family since the night in the bridal suite, and she received it with no more reaction than she would a useful weather report. She filed it alongside the look on Douglas's face when she had held his gaze and said, "Of course the land is still there. Of course it is." She needed them to believe she didn't know yet. She needed 6 more weeks of them believing that. 6 weeks was enough time for Grace to build the legal structure that would need to be in place before the first document was filed. The house on Kensington Lane was dark when they arrived. She went upstairs. She sat at her desk. She opened the notebook that said grocery lists on the cover and found the word she had written the week before. Possible. She wrote under it, in small and steady letters. "Douglas knows. He's watching. Don't move yet." She closed the notebook. She was not afraid. She had never, even as a child, been afraid of situations that were complicated. Her grandmother had made sure of that. Complicated meant there were many things to understand, and understanding things was the only activity Sarah had ever found genuinely satisfying. She understood a great deal now. She turned off the desk lamp and went to bed, and outside the city hummed, and the cherry tree in the garden held its bare branches against the dark sky, and 11 months and 9 days ticked quietly off the clock. Grace found Owen Barker on a Tuesday. He was not a ghost after all. He was simply a man who had learned to be very quiet about his visibility. 49 years old, a former solicitor who had been struck off the register 12 years ago for a professional conduct matter that Grace described as creative documentation, which Sarah understood to mean falsifying. He had since worked in the private sector as a company director for hire, the kind of man whose name appears on filings while other names do not. Grace had his home address, his phone number, registered to a company, and most importantly, his connection to the coal estate. He had served as a director on 3 other coal-linked entities over the past 8 years, 2 of which had since been dissolved after their purpose was served. Sarah said, "So he's done this before?" Grace said, "The structure is identical each time. A shell company receives an asset. The shell is later dissolved. The asset migrates to the beneficial owner through a series of intercompany transfers that look, on the surface, completely ordinary." Sarah said, "Can we trace it all the way to Celestine?" Grace said, "That's the question I've been working on for 10 days, and the answer is yes, but only if we move carefully. If we move too fast, they'll restructure and we'll lose the thread." Sarah said, "How long do we need?" Grace said, 6 weeks. Then we file. 6 weeks. She had been living in the house on Kensington Lane for 8 weeks at this point, and in those 8 weeks the shape of the household had changed around her so quietly that even she occasionally had to stop and look back at where she had started to understand how far she had come. She had the household accounts. She had the study. She had Henry's loyalty, which had been earned through consistency, and through one particular morning when he had arrived at work to find that she had already handled a supplier delivery dispute he had been dreading for 2 days, having called the company herself the evening before and resolved it in 10 minutes. After that, he had stopped thinking of her as a guest in the house. She had begun, cautiously, to develop what she thought of as a working relationship with Carol. Carol was not won over by anything as simple as competence. She had worked for competent people before and had learned to separate competence from trustworthiness. What she responded to, Sarah found, was straightforwardness. Carol had spent years in households where she was required to manage the gap between what people said and what they meant, to be the buffer between official narratives and actual ones. Sarah simply told her things as they were, which turned out to be extremely unusual and, to Carol, extremely restful. She did not tell Carol about the land. She did not tell anyone in the household about the land. That was held inside a different room of her life, a room with one door, and that door was to Grace. The dinner on Sunday had become a monthly fixture. Celestine called it a family gathering, which it was in the way that some performances are family gatherings. Structured, catered, everyone playing a role that had been decided in advance. Sarah played the role of the quiet new wife who was still finding her footing. She played it well because it required almost nothing of her except stillness, which she was very good at, and because the distance between that role and what she was actually doing was part of the strategy. Douglas was always there. He watched her with the careful attention of someone who is not sure what they are watching. She gave him nothing additional to work with. She asked him about the community council he had mentioned, once, briefly, and he told her more than he intended to. She knew he told her more than he intended to because his eyes changed when he realized it. But what she got from him was the history of her grandmother's land, as Douglas understood it, who had wanted it over the years, who had made offers that patients had refused, who had been disappointed by those refusals. There had been 3 serious offers in her grandmother's lifetime, all refused. The last had been made by a property development company with Cole Family Investment, and Patience had turned it down with a letter that Douglas described, with a small and involuntary admiration, as the most precise refusal I've ever read from someone who didn't have a legal team. Sarah thought about that letter. She had not known about it. She thought about her grandmother at whatever age she had been when she wrote it, holding her land in one hand and the offer in the other, and choosing. She thought about this at the dinner table with the chandelier overhead, and Celestine asking Patricia whether she had been to the new restaurant on Harwick Street. And then she thought about the fact that the Cole family had tried to take her grandmother's land while her grandmother was alive, had been refused, and had waited, patiently, across multiple years and a marriage arrangement, to take it from the daughter instead. This thought arrived on a Tuesday evening during the 3rd dinner, and she carried it home in the car, and into the house and up the stairs, and she did not say a single word to Damien about it, which was becoming both easier and harder simultaneously. Easier because she had always been private, harder because she had been watching him more carefully in recent weeks, and what she found there was not what she had expected, and she was still in the process of deciding what to do about that. Damien Cole was, she had discovered, a more complicated person than the man who had said, "I don't want you," in a flat voice in a hotel room 2 months ago. That man existed. She did not revise him away, but he was not the only thing there. He worked very hard, not in the performative way of some men who use work as a costume, but in the quiet, relentless way of someone who is trying to keep multiple things from falling. She could read the shape of his days in his face when he came home. She had become, without intending to, someone who could read his face reasonably well, the specific tension at the corner of his jaw when a deal had gone sideways, the different quality of tiredness that came from bad news versus long hours, the way he held his glass differently when he had been in a room with his mother. She noticed these things the way she noticed everything, as data. She kept them separate from anything that might be called feeling. The 3rd dinner produced one additional piece of data that she had not anticipated. After dessert, when the table was being cleared and the smaller conversations had started up, Celestine drew Sarah into a separate corner of the large sitting room under the pretext of showing her something, a photograph on the wall, the family home where Damien had grown up. Celestine said, "I hope you've been settling in well. That house can feel very large when you're new to it." Sarah said, "I find I like large spaces." Celestine smiled. She said, "Damien can be difficult to reach. He's always been very closed in." Sarah said nothing. She waited. Celestine said, "He had a difficult time a few years ago, a relationship that ended badly. It made him careful." The word careful again. Douglas had used it about Celestine herself. Now Celestine was using it about Damien. Sarah found this interesting. Celestine said, "I want you to know that I hope you're happy here, that I hope you'll both be happy." She said it with the face she wore when she was performing warmth, the eyes a fraction behind the smile, the particular angle of her head that suggested attentiveness without actually attending. Sarah had catalogued this face across 3 dinners, and she knew it by now, the way you know a song that you didn't like the first time you heard it. She said, "Thank you, Celestine, that means a great deal." She said it in exactly the same register, the same warmth, the same angle. She gave it back to her like a clean mirror. Something moved very briefly in Celestine's eyes. Then she smiled again and they rejoined the table. In the car on the way home, Damien said, "What did she say to you?" Sarah said, "She told me about a relationship you had. That ended badly." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She had no reason to tell you that." Sarah said, "Probably not." He said, "It was 7 years ago." She said, "You don't have to explain it to me." He said, "I know I don't." Another silence. The city outside, moving past. He said, "Her name was Nina. We were together for 2 years. My mother decided she wasn't suitable and she—" He stopped. He said, "My mother had a conversation with Nina's employer. Nina lost her job. Then she lost her apartment because the lease was linked to the job. Then she left the city. I found out what my mother had done 3 months after Nina was gone. The car was very quiet." Sarah looked at the passing streetlights and thought about the kind of person who does that, who moves people like pieces on a board without their knowledge, who considers the collateral damage of other people's lives a reasonable cost, and who then sits at the head of a dinner table every month and says, "I hope you'll both be happy." She said, "Did you confront her about it?" He said, "Yes." She said, "And?" He said, "She told me I would understand one day that she had only done what was necessary." Sarah thought about that. Then she said, "Do you believe her?" He said, "No." It was the most honest word he had said to her since the bridal suite, the most honest word he had said to her that was not about her, about his own family, his own history. It arrived in the car between them and stayed, and she let it stay. She did not tell him about the land. She was not ready. She still did not know if he was involved in the land arrangement, and she would not know for certain until Grace had finished mapping the beneficial ownership chain. It was possible, she considered this seriously, without emotional interference, that Damien had been his mother's instrument, the same way Sarah had been her father's, that the marriage had been arranged around them both as a vehicle for a transaction neither of them had fully understood. Possible. Or he had known and said nothing. That possibility also existed, and she did not close it off. She went to bed that night and lay in the dark and thought about a woman named Nina, who had had a job and an apartment and a relationship and had lost all 3 because a woman with power had decided she was not suitable. She thought about the word suitable and what it meant coming from someone like Celestine, and how it had nothing to do with Nina's qualities and everything to do with what Nina might have given Damien, specifically, the autonomy to make his own choices. She thought about her grandmother's letter, the one Douglas had described as the most precise refusal he had ever read from someone without a legal team. She had never read that letter. She wondered if it still existed. She got up. She went to the study. She opened the lockbox she kept under the desk, the one from her apartment, with her grandmother's title documents, and took out the folder. She had looked at the contents many times, the title document, the survey report, the graph paper plans in her grandmother's handwriting, a photograph of the land taken from the eastern edge, just empty grass and the city skyline in the distance. And at the back of the folder, folded into a neat square, something she had not unfolded before because she had not known what it was. She unfolded it now. It was a letter, written by hand in her grandmother's particular handwriting, small, upright, very clear, addressed to the director of the Coal Property Development Company, dated 14 years ago. She read it. It was 3 paragraphs long. It began, "I understand you believe my land would be better used by a company than by a family, and I want to be clear that I find this belief not only incorrect but somewhat revealing of the assumptions your company makes about what land is for." It continued, "The land in question has been in my family for 3 generations. My grandmother worked for it, and my mother kept it, and I intend to give it to my granddaughter. It is not available for purchase, development, or acquisition of any kind, now or at any future point while I am living." And it ended, "If you contact me again about this matter, I will make our correspondence publicly available through whatever means seem most appropriate. I trust you will find this a useful piece of information going forward." No legal team. Just her grandmother, sitting at whatever table she sat at, writing 3 paragraphs in her clear, upright handwriting, to the director of a coal family company. Sarah folded the letter back exactly as she had found it. She put it in the folder. She put the folder in the lockbox. She sat at the desk for a long time in the quiet of the house. Then she picked up her phone and sent Grace a message. I need you to find out if the coal company made a formal offer for my grandmother's land 14 years ago. I need any written record of that offer, and any correspondence. Grace replied in the morning, already on it. Of course she was. Sarah made coffee and stood at the kitchen window, and watched the garden wake up in the gray morning light, and for the first time since the night in the bridal suite, she felt something she had not felt in a long while. Not anger, not calculation, not the careful quiet of a person doing something that requires patience. She felt the particular warmth of being the granddaughter of someone who had already, once, done exactly what Sarah was about to do. Grace found the offer documents a week later. The coal development company had made a formal written offer for the land 14 years ago. The offer was in writing, on company letterhead, signed by the then director. It was followed by 2 further letters when the first received no reply, and then a final communication after Patience's letter arrived. A single short paragraph that Grace sent to Sarah in a photograph, which read, "We note your position, and will not pursue the matter further at this time." At this time. 3 words at the end of a sentence that had been sitting in some archive for 14 years, patient as anything. Sarah showed Grace the letter her grandmother had written. Grace read it and did not speak for a moment. Then she said, "I want to submit this as a character evidence document in the challenge filing. It establishes a history of attempted acquisition predating the transfer by 14 years. It shows pattern and intent." Sarah said, "Yes, use it." Grace said, "Your grandmother knew what she was dealing with." Sarah said, "She always did." There were things Sarah had taken from her grandmother, the patience, the list-making, the kind of listening that other people mistook for silence. She had always known she had these things. She had not known, until the night she unfolded that letter, that she had also taken something else, the particular quality of being someone who cannot be frightened into moving, when moving is the wrong thing to do. Patience Adaize had held that land through 3 formal acquisition attempts over 40 years. She had held it with no legal team and no institutional support and no one at the family dinner table who was on her side. She had held it through difficult finances and through her daughter's death and through her son-in-law's pressure and through every version of the argument that what she was holding was more valuable as capital than as a plan. She had held it, and she had died holding it, and she had given it to Sarah. And someone had taken it from Sarah's hands 11 days before her wedding, while she was not looking. Sarah thought about all of this on a Thursday evening in the study, with the desk lamp on and the house quiet around her, and she felt something in her chest tighten into a shape she recognized, the particular clarity that arrives when a person has spent long enough thinking about what is right and is now ready to act. She was ready. She told Grace, "Let's move in 4 weeks instead of 6. Grace said, "I can have the filing ready in 4 weeks if you can get me everything we discussed." Sarah said, "Give me the list again." She wrote it down on a new page of the grocery notebook, in very small letters, in a handwriting that looked unremarkable to anyone who might happen to see it. The list had 9 items. Documentation of the original title, the marriage contract and the asset disclosure papers Sarah had signed, bank records showing her account at the time of transfer, demonstrating she received no payment, a signed statement from Sarah, character evidence, which included her grandmother's letter, the beneficial ownership analysis of Meridian Holdings, and 3 additional items that Grace was still in the process of securing, which Sarah did not write down even in unremarkable handwriting. She had 8 of the 9. The 9th was the one that required something she had been putting off, which was a conversation with her father. She had not spoken to her father since the wedding. He had called twice. She had replied by text both times, brief and warm, enough to keep him from becoming alarmed. She had not called him. She had not visited. She had given herself the first 2 months to do the groundwork before she had to look at him, because looking at him would require a quality of performance she was not yet ready to sustain. She was ready now. She called him on a Friday evening. He answered on the 3rd ring with the particular brightness of a man who is relieved to be called and does not want to show it. He said, "Sarah, I've been thinking about you." She said, "I know, Dad. I've been meaning to call." She kept her voice warm, fond, the voice of a daughter who is still, as far as he knows, in the process of building a marriage and a life, and has not yet examined the details of what she signed 11 days before her wedding. They talked for 40 minutes. He told her about the neighborhood, about a renovation he was planning in the kitchen, about a cousin's engagement. She told him about the house on Kensington Lane, about the garden, about Henry's cooking. She asked about his health. He asked about hers. And then, easily, naturally, folded into the conversation the way a good accountant folds a discrepancy into a routine question, she said, I was looking at the papers from the wedding prep, Dad. The asset declarations. There was one I couldn't fully make out, the one about the property records. Could you dig out your copy? He was quiet for a fraction of a second longer than the question required. He said, "Oh, those were just standard forms, love. Legal standard. Nothing to worry about." She said, "I know. I just want to have a complete set for my files. Could you send me a copy?" He said, "I'll have to find them." She said, "Whenever you have a minute. No rush." She ended the call. She sat with the phone in her hand and the lamp on in the study and thought about what that fraction of a second silence meant and what it would cost her father when this was over, and whether she had room in herself to feel the cost alongside the necessity. She found that she did. Both things were true simultaneously. She loved her father, and what he had done was unforgivable, and both of those things would be true after this was over, and she was not going to pretend otherwise to make herself simpler to understand. The next morning she went downstairs and found Damien in the kitchen, which was unusual. He was at the island with coffee and his phone, in weekend clothes, which were different from his work clothes in a way she had not paid attention to before, slightly less armored. He looked up when she came in and said good morning. She said, "You're home." He said, "I work from home on Saturdays sometimes." She said, "I didn't know that." He said, "You didn't ask." It was not said with sharpness. It was simply an observation, and she received it as such. She made coffee. He went back to his phone. She sat at the other end of the island with her own coffee and looked at the garden through the kitchen windows, the cherry tree, the low hedge, the gray morning sky. And for a while they were simply two people in a kitchen on a Saturday morning, which was so ordinary that the ordinariness of it was almost startling. He said without looking up, "Are you going out today?" She said, "Later." "You?" He said, "I have lunch with someone." She said, "Okay." He put his phone down. He looked at her. He said, "I want to ask you something." She waited. He said, "Are you all right?" Not the surface answer. Actually. It was the word surface that caught her. She had not expected him to use that word, and in that exact configuration, and she was good enough at what she did to know when something was genuinely unexpected, rather than simply appearing to be. This was genuinely unexpected. She looked at him. She said, "What made you ask like that?" He said, "I watch you. I think you watch me. I think we've both been watching each other for 2 months and nobody has said anything that means very much yet." She was quiet for a moment. The garden was gray and still. She said, "I think that's probably right." He said, "So are you all right?" She thought about what to give him, not for his sake. She was past performing for people's comfort, but for hers. She thought about what was true that she could say, what was real, what was not the version of herself she was showing to the household, or to Celestine, or to Douglas, or to her father on the phone. She said, "I am working on something, and when it's done I will tell you about it. And you may be angry when I do, or you may not, and I genuinely don't know which." He looked at her. He said, "Does it involve me?" She said, "It involves your family." He said, "My mother." She said nothing. He picked up his coffee. He looked at the garden for a moment, then he said, "Whatever it is, I'd like to know when you're ready to tell me." She said, "You will." He got up, put his mug in the sink and said, "I'll be back by 3. She said, "I won't be here. I'll be back by 7. He nodded. He left. She sat in the kitchen for a while longer. She thought about what had just happened, the most direct conversation they had had since the night in the bridal suite, and in it he had not been the man from the hotel, the closed, flat man who said, "I don't want you." He had been something else, someone trying to make a space that was large enough for both of them to be honest in. She did not trust it yet. She had learned to distinguish between people who tried to make space and people who made space, and he had only tried. But trying was something. Trying was a direction. She had 4 weeks until Grace filed. She had one more conversation with her father to complete, one more document to locate, and 4 weeks in which to do everything else while not appearing to do anything at all. She washed her mug. She got her coat. She went out into the gray city morning with the grocery notebook in her bag, and her grandmother's stubbornness in her chest, and the list behind her eyes. Exact and ordered, ticking toward its end. Her father sent the documents on a Monday. Not all of them. He sent 3 pages, the summary sheet, the declaration of personal assets, and the property inventory page. And in the email he wrote, "Found these in the wedding folder. Hope this helps." He did not send the 4th page, which was the one Grace needed, the transfer authorization document that had been inserted between the property inventory and the signing page, with just enough visual continuity to look like part of the same section. Sarah looked at the 3 pages he had sent. She thought about the 4th. She forwarded what she had to Grace and wrote, "He didn't send the relevant page. He knows which page it is." Grace replied, "We can get it another way. Give me until Wednesday." And Sarah put her phone on the desk and sat with the simple, unadorned fact of what her father had just done. He had sent her enough to seem helpful. He had not sent enough to be useful. He had threaded the needle between cooperation and obstruction in a way that let him feel he had done his part while not actually giving her anything that would hurt him. She thought about who had taught him to do that. She thought about how long he had been in business with people who operated this way. She wrote in the grocery notebook, "He's covering himself. He knows." Wednesday came. Grace sent her a message. "I have it." She had gone to the land registry directly and requested the full transfer instrument as a matter of public record. The fourth page was there, the transfer authorization, and it bore Sarah's signature and, next to it, a witness signature. The witness was recorded as a Mr. D. Cole, Damien. Sarah sat at the desk and looked at the document on her phone screen for a long time. The study was quiet. Outside, she could hear Henry in the kitchen below, the particular sounds of someone at work, the click of the cooker, water running briefly. The cherry tree in the garden was beginning to show new leaves, small and bright green against the gray sky. She looked at the signature. D. Cole. She turned the phone over. She put it face down on the desk. She sat in the quiet. She thought, he may have been told it was a standard marriage document. He may have been told what it was and chosen to sign it anyway. She had no way to know from a signature, and she was not going to decide which was true on the basis of what she wanted to be true, because that was not how she had ever done anything, and she was not going to start now when the stakes were at their highest. She thought, find out first, then decide. She picked up the phone and called Grace. Grace said, "I know. I've seen it." Sarah said, "Does it complicate the filing?" Grace said, "Not the legal filing, no. The transfer was still fraudulent on the basis of Sarah's misinformation, regardless of who witnessed it. But it means Damien is named in the document." Sarah said, "Which means when this is filed he will find out immediately." Grace said, "Within 24 hours, yes. His solicitor will notify him." Sarah said, "How long until we file?" Grace said, 3 weeks. Sarah said, "All right." She hung up. She went downstairs. She made lunch and ate it in the kitchen standing up, looking at the garden, and she let herself feel the full weight of what the signature might mean without trying to reduce it to something manageable. It was not manageable. It was the difference between a man who was used and a man who used, and she did not know which she was living with. What she knew was that in 3 weeks it would stop being a question she held alone. She went back to the study. She worked through the afternoon on the legitimate consulting work she had taken on 2 weeks earlier, a small logistics firm on the other side of the city, whose financial records were a mess, and whose director had hired her on the recommendation of a friend, not knowing who she was married to, which was exactly the way she wanted it. The consulting work was not strategy. It was not linked to any of what she was building with Grace. It was simply her own thing, in her own name, producing its own income, which went into her own account that she had opened the week after moving to Kensington Lane. She had not mentioned this to anyone in the household. It was, she had decided, not anyone's business but hers. Damien came home at 7 that evening. He came into the study without knocking, the first time he had done this, and she looked up, and he had that pressured, tired look she had learned to read, but with something additional in it tonight, something she had not seen before. He said, "I need to tell you something." She said, "Sit down." He sat. He put his hands on the desk. He looked at them for a moment, and she let the silence be there. He said, "There's a legal matter, related to property." She waited. He said, "My mother asked me, before the wedding, to witness some documents. She said they were marriage administration papers. I signed as a witness. I didn't read them in full." He looked up at her. He said, "I don't know what was in them. I've been told this evening that one of them may have been a property transfer document. I don't know whose property. I don't know the details yet." Sarah looked at him. She said, "Who told you this evening?" He said, "My solicitor. My mother's company received some kind of inquiry through the land registry today. My solicitor was alerted. He called me." She understood then. Her own request to the land registry on Wednesday had triggered a notification, a flag on the document. She had not anticipated that the inquiry alone would move so fast, and she sat with that for one moment, recalibrating. He said, "Sarah, is this about you?" She looked at him. The lamp on the desk, the window, dark outside, the house around them both, quiet. She said, "Yes." He said, "Your land." She said, "My grandmother's land, my land. It was transferred out of my name 11 days before our wedding. You witnessed the document." He looked at her and she watched the information arrive in him. Not the information of her land, because he may not have known that part, but the information of what his signature meant and where it appeared, and what he had put his name to without reading. She saw the exact moment he understood. He said, "I didn't know what I was signing." She said, "I believe you. I'm not certain of it yet, but I believe it." He said, "My mother." She said, "Yes." He sat very still, the particular stillness of someone who has just received a piece of information that retroactively reorganizes a significant number of other pieces of information. She watched it happen, the recalculation moving across his face, not hidden, not managed. He said, "This is why you married me." She said, "This is partly why my father agreed to the arrangement. I didn't know about the land until after." He said, "And the consulting work, the household accounts, He stopped. She watched him process the past 3 months through the lens of what he now knew, the way you might reread a letter you had initially misunderstood. He said, "You've been building a case." She said, "I've been recovering what was taken from me." He said, "With my mother as the target." She said, "Yes." He stood up. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her, looking at the dark garden. She waited. She had learned, from him, specifically, that waiting after a person stands up and turns away is more respectful than filling the space. He said, "What do you need from me?" The question was so direct and arrived so unexpectedly that she let it land without immediately answering. She had prepared for anger. She had prepared for denial. She had prepared for the slow, careful retreat of a man who decides his mother's interest is ultimately his own. She had not prepared for "What do you need from me?" said to the window, with the garden dark behind it. She said, "Nothing yet. In 3 weeks my solicitor will file the challenge. When she does, your solicitor will be notified. At that point I would like you not to work against it." He turned around. He said, "I'm not going to work against it." She said, "You're also not going to warn your mother." It was not a question. He held her gaze. He said, "No." She said, "All right." She turned back to the desk. She picked up her pen. She looked at the spreadsheet on the screen in front of her, which was the logistics firm's quarterly cash flow, and was completely unrelated to any of this, and was, in its ordinariness, something close to a comfort. Behind her she heard him move toward the door. He stopped. He said, "Sarah." She said, "Yes." He said, "I'm sorry, for what I said in the hotel room, and for every day since then that I've made this more difficult than it had to be." She did not turn around. She said, "I know." She heard him leave. She sat at the desk for a long while after, not working, not thinking in any directed way, just letting the evening sit around her the way evenings do, when something significant has just shifted and the full extent of the shift has not yet been determined. She thought about the word sorry, what it cost people to say it, whether saying it was the beginning of something or just the end of something else. She did not have an answer to that. She had 3 weeks. She went back to the spreadsheet. 3 days later, on a Thursday afternoon, she came home from a meeting with the logistics firm's director to find a large cream envelope on the desk in the study, her name on the front in handwriting she did not recognize. She opened it. Inside was a single card, heavy stock, no printed header. Handwritten, it said, "I understand you have been looking into some property matters. I think it would be better for everyone if we sat down and spoke before any further steps are taken. I hope you'll consider this. C. Celestine." Sarah looked at the card for a moment. She noted the handwriting. Large, confident, the particular handwriting of someone who does not expect to be disagreed with. She noted the phrasing, "better for everyone." Better was doing a great deal of work in that sentence. Better for everyone meant better for Celestine. She put the card back in the envelope. She put the envelope in the desk drawer. She picked up her phone and texted Grace. "She knows." She sent a card. "We may need to move the filing forward." Grace called 30 seconds later. She said, "How does she know?" Sarah said, "The land registry flag. It moved faster than either of us expected." Grace said, "She must have a standing alert on any inquiry related to the Meridian documents." Sarah said, "Can we file in 10 days instead of 3 weeks?" Grace said, "I can file in 7 if you give me this weekend." Sarah said, "Give me your list." Grace gave her the list. Sarah wrote it in the grocery notebook in small clear letters. When she had finished, she said, "I'll have everything to you by Saturday." She hung up. She went to the kitchen. She stood at the window and looked at the garden. The cherry tree with its new leaves, the low hedge, the garden that was beginning to look like it had always been hers. And she thought, 7 days. She was not frightened. She was not even particularly agitated. She was the granddaughter of a woman who had sent a handwritten letter to a coal company director and told him what would happen if he contacted her again, and had then not been contacted for 14 years. She was, she thought, ready for this part. She had 7 days, but Celestine did not wait. On the second day after the card, Sarah came downstairs to find Celestine in the sitting room. She had arrived without calling ahead. She had been let in by Carol, who came to Sarah's study with an expression that was professionally neutral and personally apologetic, and said, "Mrs. Cole Sr. is here." Sarah had thanked her and asked her to bring tea, and then she had put down her pen and gone downstairs at a pace that was unhurried. Celestine was standing at the window when Sarah came in, looking at the garden in a way that suggested she had been standing there for some time and had considered and discarded several opening lines. She was wearing a dark coat, still on, which meant she had either not planned to stay or wanted to signal she had not planned to stay, and the distinction between those two things said something. Sarah filed away. She said, "Celestine, this is unexpected." Celestine turned. Her expression was warm, as it always was, with the eyes running slightly behind. She said, "I hope you don't mind. I was passing and I thought, we haven't really had a chance to talk properly. Just the two of us." Sarah said, "Of course. Please, sit down." Celestine sat. Sarah sat across from her. Between them was the low coffee table and, in a moment, Carol with tea, which Sarah thanked her for and which Celestine accepted with the automatic grace of someone for whom tea appearing is simply what rooms do. Celestine said, "I sent you a card." Sarah said, "You did." Celestine said, "I hope it wasn't presumptuous. I just think, when family matters become complicated, it's always better to talk before things go further." The word family. Sarah noted it. It was doing work in this sentence. It was suggesting that Sarah was inside something she should feel loyalty to. She said, "What specifically did you want to talk about?" Celestine said, "There have been some inquiries, related to a property matter. I'm told it involves some documents signed before the wedding." Sarah said, "Yes." Celestine said, "I think there may have been a misunderstanding." She said it with the particular texture of someone who has decided that misunderstanding is the version of this that will hold, not guilt, not wrongdoing. A misunderstanding, a thing that happens between people of good intentions who simply did not communicate clearly enough. Sarah looked at her. She said, "What was misunderstood?" Celestine said, "The transfer documents were prepared in a standard way for marriage asset consolidation. It's quite normal for family properties to be moved into a shared holding company when there's a marriage. Your father understood this and agreed to it." Sarah said, "I didn't agree to it." Celestine said, "Your signature is on the document." Sarah said, "It is. I signed it believing it was a different kind of document. I wasn't told what it was." Celestine held her gaze. The warmth in her eyes shifted very slightly, not enough to be called something else, but enough for Sarah to see what was underneath it, the thing that was actually in the room. She said, "I'm sure we can resolve this without involving solicitors. There are simpler ways too." Sarah said, "The filing will be made in 5 days." The sentence arrived without preparation, without cushioning. She had decided, in the moment before she said it, that clarity was more useful than anything else. Celestine was quiet. Sarah said, "The beneficial ownership of Meridian Holdings has been fully documented. The chain from the transfer to CF Capital Partners to your personal investment vehicle has been traced. The filing will include all of it, as well as a 14-year history of acquisition attempts against my grandmother's land that will establish pattern and intent." Celestine's face was doing something Sarah had not seen it do before. Not the managed warmth. Something older than that, the particular expression of someone who thought they were walking into a conversation and finds themselves in a conclusion. She said, "You're very prepared." Sarah said, "Yes." Celestine said, "Damien, does he know?" Sarah said, "He does." Something moved in Celestine's face that Sarah could not name and did not try to. She said, "I see." There was a pause. Carol appeared silently in the doorway, looked at the room, and disappeared again. The house was very quiet. Celestine said, "What do you want, Sarah? Not legally. What do you want?" It was the first time she had used Sarah's first name without the particular performance she usually attached to it, and because of that, it was the first thing she had said in this conversation that Sarah believed was honest. Sarah said, "My grandmother's land back in my name. That's what I want." Celestine said, "And if I return it, voluntarily?" Sarah said, "Then the filing addresses only the transfer, not the company history, not the 14 years. Celestine looked at her. She was still holding her teacup, which she had not drunk from. She said, "I'll need to speak with my solicitor." Sarah said, "Of course." She stood. Celestine stood. At the door, Celestine paused. She said, "You're like her, you know, your grandmother." Sarah said, "I know." Celestine left. Sarah heard the front door, and then the car on the drive, and then silence. She went back to the study and sat at the desk. She called Grace. She said, "She came in person. She's going to offer a voluntary return." Grace said, "What are the terms?" Sarah said, "I offered to limit the filing to the transfer only, not the company history." Grace said, "Do you want to do that?" Sarah thought about it. She thought about Meridian Holdings and CF Capital and the chain of nominee structures and the 14 years and the letter her grandmother had written at whatever table she sat at. She thought about Nina, who had had a job and an apartment and a life. She said, "No, file everything. In 5 days as planned." Grace said, "All right." Sarah said, "If she returns the land voluntarily before then, we negotiate. If she doesn't, she doesn't." Grace said, "Understood." Sarah put the phone down. She opened the logistics firm spreadsheet. She worked for 2 hours. She was good at her work and she liked it, and it required all of her attention, which was exactly what she needed. At 6 o'clock, she heard Damien's key in the door. He came upstairs. He knocked on the study door. She said, "Come in." He looked at her. She said, "Your mother came today." He said, "I know. She called me." She said, "And?" He said, "I told her I wasn't going to intervene." She looked at him. He looked back. He said, "What did she say to you?" Sarah said, "She called it a misunderstanding." He said, "Of course she did." He came in and sat in the chair opposite the desk, the chair she had brought from her old apartment, the good reading chair with the worn arm. And he put his hands on his knees and looked at the desk between them with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the face of a man who is doing the slow, uncomfortable work of understanding something about his own life. He said, "She did this to Nina too. Not property, but the same kind of move, something that looked like paperwork, administrative, normal. And by the time anyone understood what had happened, it was already done." Sarah said, "I know about Nina." He said, "She told you." Sarah said, "She told me there was a difficult relationship." Douglas filled in some of the rest. He said, "Douglas." She said, "He watches everything. He's been watching this." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want to give you a statement, if it helps the filing, about the witness signature, that I was told they were standard marriage documents." She looked at him. She said, "That would help." He said, "Then I'll give it. I'll call Grace on Monday." He stood up. At the door he stopped, the way he had been stopping at doors between them lately, the way someone stops when they have arrived somewhere they weren't sure they were going. He said, "I know I haven't made this easy, the last several months." She said, "No." He said, I'm working out what that means. What's on the other side of it?" She said, "So am I." He said, "Fair enough." He left. She sat in the quiet of the study with the lamp on, and the grocery notebook on the desk, and the spreadsheet open on the screen, and 5 days on the clock. She wrote in the notebook, under the last entry, 3 words, "He gave it." She was not sure yet what it was, the statement, or something else, something harder to name. She was not going to name it yet. She was not going to give names to things that were still in the process of becoming themselves. She had learned that from her grandmother, too. The filing was made on a Friday morning. Grace sent Sarah a text at 10:47 that said, "Filed," and then, 2 minutes later, a second text, all of it. Sarah was at the logistics firm's office when the messages arrived. She was in the middle of a conversation with the director about his year-end figures, and she excused herself for a moment, went to the corridor outside the meeting room, and read the 2 messages standing against the wall with the hum of the office around her. She typed back, "Thank you." She put the phone in her pocket. She went back into the meeting room and finished the conversation about the year-end figures, which took another 40 minutes, and which she handled with complete attention, because the director was a decent man, who was paying her for her time and her expertise, and not for what she happened to be managing on the side. On the way home, she allowed herself 10 minutes of simply looking out the window of the cab, at the city moving past, at the buildings and the people and the ordinary Friday afternoon life of a place that knew nothing and cared nothing about what had just been filed on its behalf, and she let the 10 minutes be what they were, uncomplicated, before she went back to thinking. The filing had named Meridian Holdings. It had named CF Capital Partners. The beneficial ownership chain was documented in full. It had named Owen Barker, the front director. It had named, in the context of the witness signature, D. Cole, and Grace had attached Damien's signed statement clarifying the circumstances under which he had witnessed the document, which his solicitor had approved and submitted Monday as promised. It had also named, without the softening of any euphemism, C.F. Cole as the ultimate beneficial owner. Celestine. Sarah had been told it would take 48 to 72 hours for the formal notifications to go out from the court. The Cole family solicitors would receive their copy by Monday morning at the latest. The document would become public record. She had Saturday and Sunday. She did not know what Damien had told his mother between Thursday and Friday. She did not know if Celestine had used those days to prepare a voluntary return or to prepare a defense. She would find out on Monday. She arrived home. The house was empty. Henry had left his usual note on the kitchen counter. Dinner in the oven, 30 minutes at 180. And she stood in the kitchen and read the note and thought about how much she had come to value this small, reliable thing. Henry's note. The particular orderliness of a man who understood that the most useful gift you can give someone is knowing what they will find when they arrive home. She put the oven on. She made coffee. She sat at the kitchen island and let herself breathe in the specific way her grandmother had taught her. Slowly, through the nose, all the way to the ground. She had done it. Everything that could be done from her side had been done. The rest was outside her hands now, which was its own particular adjustment. She had spent months with everything inside her hands, moving pieces, building structure, and now the structure was built and she was simply in it, waiting to see what it held. She ate dinner alone. She read for 2 hours. She went to bed early and slept heavily, which she had always done after periods of sustained effort, because her body understood that the work was done and did not need to be convinced. Saturday arrived gray and quiet. She was in the garden at 7 with her coffee, sitting on the bench under the cherry tree, which had by now moved past its new leaves into full summer leaf, the green dense and settled, the tree entirely itself. She heard the back door. Damien came out in a coat with his own coffee. He did not ask to sit down. He sat on the other end of the bench. They were not close enough to touch, but closer than they had ever been in this garden, which had until now been Sarah's space in the mornings, and his space in the evenings, and a neutral territory during the hours in between. He said, "It was filed yesterday." She said, "Yes." He said, "My solicitor called me this morning." She waited. He said, "My mother has had her solicitor call in response. She's contesting it." Sarah had expected this. She said, "I know." He said, She's saying that my statement was coerced." That was new. Sarah looked at the cherry tree. He said, "She called me last night. She said if I had simply reviewed the documents before witnessing them, as a responsible person should, this would not have happened." Sarah said, "She's putting the responsibility on you." He said, "Yes." She said, "Does that surprise you?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "No." The word came out with something attached to it, not self-pity, not anger, just the flat weight of a truth that has been arrived at the long way around. She said, "She's done it before. With Nina." He said, "With Nina, with my uncle, with Douglas in '98. There was a company dissolution that lost Douglas most of his savings. She had told him it was a standard restructure." Sarah looked at him. He was looking at the garden, his coffee going cold, the same way she let her coffee go cold on this bench when she was thinking about something too big to drink around. She said, "Douglas knows." He said, "Yes." She said, "Is he on your side or hers?" Damien thought about this. He said, "He's on his own side, which means he'll go wherever he thinks the weight is falling." She said, "The weight is falling our way." He said, "I know." They sat for a while in the morning quiet. A bird moved through the cherry tree above them, rustling the leaves briefly, and then was gone. He said, "The statement I gave, it was the truth. I want you to know that. I signed those documents believing what she told me. I don't do this. What she does." Sarah said, "I believe you." He said, "You said that before, that you believe it but aren't certain." She said, "I'm more certain now." He turned and looked at her. She kept her eyes on the garden. He said, "What changed?" She said, "The way you reacted when I told you. People who know what they're doing don't react the way you did." He said, "How did I react?" She said, "Like someone whose floor just moved." He was quiet. Then he said, "That's accurate." She stood up. She picked up her coffee cup, which was cold. She said, "I'm going to work this morning. Are you home?" He said, "I'm home." She said, "If you want to, you could look at the filing documents. Grace has a copy available. It might be useful for you to understand exactly what's in it before Monday." He said, "I'd like that." She went inside. She called Grace and told her to send the filing copy to Damien directly, and Grace said she would, and Sarah said thank you and hung up and went to the study. She worked through the morning on the logistics firm's accounts, which were coming together well. The director was a good faith client and the numbers were honest, and the errors were the kind that come from busyness rather than intention, which made the work clean and satisfying. She finished the quarterly model by noon, sent it over, and got a reply within 20 minutes. This is exactly what I needed. Thank you. She printed it. She put it in a folder. She allowed herself to feel the small, real pleasure of good work delivered on time. At 1 o'clock she went downstairs and found Damien at the kitchen island with Grace's filing documents spread in front of him, and his expression was not what she had expected. She had expected anger or distress or the tight-faced quality of someone processing a betrayal. What she found was something more focused than any of those things. He looked up when she came in. He said, "She's been doing this for a long time." Sarah said, "Yes." He said, "The company structure, Meridian, CF Capital, the nominees. This is not something you put together overnight. She must have started building this months before the wedding was arranged." Sarah said, "Before the wedding was proposed." He looked at her. She said, "The acquisition history goes back 14 years. Your mother's company made an offer for this land when my grandmother was alive. It was refused. The structure you're reading is how she came back for it." He said, "Using me." She said, "Using the marriage." He put the documents down. He looked at the kitchen window, at the garden outside. He said, "My father died when I was 22. She ran everything after that. The businesses, the properties, the family accounts. She was very good at it. I thought being good at it was all that was happening." Sarah said, "It's possible to be good at something and also to do harm with it." He looked at her. She said, "It doesn't mean you didn't love her." His face did something she had not seen it do before. A brief, private movement, quickly controlled, but real. She looked away from it. She went to the fridge and started making lunch, and behind her she heard him turn back to the documents. They ate lunch together. They did not talk about the filing or about Celestine. He told her about a project at work, a development deal on the southern edge of the city, and she asked questions because the details were genuinely interesting to her, and because she had been an accountant long enough to find the financial architecture of a property deal legible and engaging. He answered in more detail than she expected, drawing a rough diagram on the back of an envelope at one point to explain how the equity was structured, which she looked at and immediately spotted 2 questions about, which he looked at and said, "You're right. How did you see that?" She said, "I read the Cole quarterly reports when you weren't using the study." He stared at her. Then he did something she had not seen before. He laughed, not a polite laugh, a real one, caught off guard. She said, "I found them in the bookshelf. They were not hidden." He said, "I'm aware they were not hidden." She said, "You should password protect your filing system." He said, "I'll keep that in mind." She finished her lunch. She took both plates to the sink. She was washing them when she heard him say, "I didn't think you were paying attention. Any of it, the first weeks." She said, "I know." He said, "I think that was a significant error on my part." She said, "It was." He said, "What were you thinking in those weeks?" She dried her hands. She turned around. He was still at the island, looking at her, and she looked back at him honestly, the way she was beginning to find she could do more easily than she had expected. She said, "I was thinking that I was in a house that I didn't choose, married to a man I didn't know, in a situation that had been arranged without my full knowledge, and I was deciding what to do about it." He said, "And what you decided was this." She said, "What I decided was to take my land back. Everything else has been a consequence of paying attention to what was actually happening around me." He said, "Including me." She said, "You've been something I've had to figure out, yes." He said, "Have you?" She said, "I'm getting there." The afternoon light came through the kitchen window and the garden was green and settled outside and the house was quiet around them, and he looked at her with the expression that had no name that she had been trying to name for weeks, and she thought, not yet for any of this. She went back to the study. Monday would come. The formal notifications would go out, Celestine's legal team would respond, the process would run, or it would settle, or something else would happen that she had not anticipated, because she had learned by now that there was always something she had not anticipated. She had also learned that she was good at handling the things she had not anticipated, which was the more important skill of the two. She opened the grocery notebook. The list had been crossed off, item by item, over the past weeks. She turned to the last used page. She wrote, in small, steady letters, "Filed." Damien gave his statement. Celestine is contesting. And under it, after a moment, lunch was good. Monday arrived with rain. Sarah was at the desk at 8 when Grace called. She picked up on the first ring. Grace said, "The notifications went out this morning. Celestine's solicitor has already been in contact with our office." Sarah said, "That was fast." Grace said, "They're contesting on 2 grounds. First, that the signing was valid because Sarah is a professional who should have exercised due diligence in reading documents presented to her. Second, that the transfer constituted a legitimate matrimonial asset consolidation." Sarah said, "And Damien's statement." Grace said, "They're saying it was produced under his wife's influence and is therefore inadmissible as character evidence." Sarah thought about this. Then she said, "What's our position?" Grace said, "Strong. The first ground is the weakest they have. The case law on informed consent and document signing is very clear, particularly where documents are deliberately embedded within a stack of unrelated papers. The second ground falls apart when we show there was no disclosure to Sarah of what was being consolidated or why. The matrimonial asset argument requires both parties to have participated knowingly." Sarah said, "And Damien's statement, even if they contest its admissibility as character evidence, the content is still on record." Grace said, "Correct. And I have one more piece of intelligence that will be relevant. I've been contacted by Douglas." Sarah sat very still. Grace said, "He called my office this morning. He said he wants to speak with you." Sarah said, "Why did he contact you rather than me directly?" Grace said, "I think he assumed I'd know where you were and how to reach you, which suggests he's been watching the legal developments closely enough to know who your solicitor is. He said, and this is the interesting part, that he has documentation of an earlier conversation between Celestine and your father, dated 18 months before the wedding." The room was very quiet. Outside, the rain was steady against the window. Sarah said, 18 months. Grace said, "He says he was present at the meeting. He says he can give a statement about the nature of the conversation, which included a discussion of the land as an asset to be acquired as part of the marriage arrangement. He says your father was told, at that meeting, what the transfer would involve." Sarah said, "Which means my father knew exactly what he was signing me up to." Grace said, "Yes." Sarah sat with this. She sat with it the way she sat with difficult things, without rushing, without reaching for the nearest emotion, just letting it be in the room until she understood its full shape. Her father had not been misled. He had been in the meeting 18 months before the wedding where the plan was laid out. He had agreed to it. He had sold his daughter's inheritance, his own mother's land, to Celestine Cole in exchange for whatever had been offered. She did not yet know what he had received. She would find out. She said, "Tell Douglas I'll meet him." They met on Wednesday at a cafe on the south side of the city, neutral ground, chosen by Douglas, a place he described as being far from anyone who might recognize either of them. Sarah arrived first. She sat at a corner table with tea she did not drink and waited. Douglas came in at 10 past the agreed time, which was not inconsiderate so much as habitual. He was, she had observed over months of dinners, a man who arrived just after the moment, never before it, as if he had spent his life calibrating just enough distance from events to see them clearly. He sat down. He ordered nothing. He looked at her across the table with the expression she had first seen at the dinner table months ago, the expression of someone recalibrating who they are dealing with. He said, "You already know about the meeting." She said, "I know there was one. I don't know the details yet." He said, 18 months before your wedding, your father came to Celestine's house. I was there because I was still managing some shared family investments at the time, before she pushed me out of those too. The conversation was about the Adese land. Celestine wanted it. She had tried through the company 14 years ago and been refused. She had tried twice more through intermediaries in the years between and been refused. Your father told her that you had inherited it, and that it was in your name and that you were unlikely to sell. He paused. He turned his coffee cup on the table, though he had not ordered coffee. He said, she asked him what it would take. He said he wanted his company's debt cleared. He had a business loan, substantial, I don't know the exact amount, that was past due, and putting him at risk. She agreed to clear it in exchange for the land, to be transferred as part of the marriage administrative paperwork which you would sign without knowing the full content. Sarah looked at him. She said, "And the marriage. Was that part of the arrangement from that meeting?" He said, "The marriage was her way of making the transfer look legitimate. A matrimonial asset consolidation is much harder to challenge than a straight commercial transfer. The marriage was the architecture. You and Damien were both inside it without being asked." He looked uncomfortable when he said Damien's name. Not defensive, uncomfortable, which was different. She said, "You're giving me this because you want something." He said, I'm giving you this because I'm 71 years old and I've watched Celestine do this to 7 different people in the time I've known her, and I have not once said anything about it to anyone, and I'm tired of the particular weight of that. It was, she thought, the truest thing she had heard from any member of that extended family since she had entered it. She said, "I'll need a signed statement." He said, "I've already written it. My solicitor has a copy. Your solicitor can contact them to collect it." He put a business card on the table. She picked it up. She said, "Does she know you're doing this?" He said, "She will by this afternoon, I expect." He stood up. At the door he paused. The pausing at doors was apparently a Cole family habit, and said, "Your grandmother wrote us a very good letter, 14 years ago. I thought you should know that I read it 3 times. I kept a copy." He left. Sarah sat for a moment, then she picked up her tea, which was cold, and drank it. She called Grace from the pavement outside. She said, "Douglas's solicitor is going to contact you. Get the statement, and I need you to run a financial background on my father. Business loans, outstanding debts, anything cleared in the 18 months before our wedding." Grace said, "I'll have something by Friday." Sarah said, "Thank you." She stood on the pavement in the rain for a moment. The city was doing its ordinary morning things around her, buses and cyclists and people with coffee cups going somewhere, and she was in the middle of it, very still, thinking about her father. He had needed money. He had had a debt he couldn't clear. And Celestine had offered him a solution that required only that he give away something that was not his to give. She thought about the phone call she had made, the warm voice she had used, the grocery list casualness with which she had asked for the documents. She thought about him sending 3 of the 4 pages and calling it helpful. She thought about standing at his kitchen table as a child while her grandmother sat across from her teaching her how to make her grandmother's particular rice dish, her father in the background somewhere, the smell of the kitchen, the particular quality of Saturday afternoon. She walked to the bus stop. She got on the bus. She went home. The filing had been made. Douglas's statement was incoming. The financial records of her father's debt would arrive by Friday. The legal machinery was running and Grace was steering it, and Sarah had done everything she could do from inside the house on Kensington Lane. She was home by 2. Damien was in his study. She heard the low sound of a work call through the closed door. She went to her own study and sat at the desk and opened the grocery notebook and wrote, in small clear letters, "Douglas came through. He's tired." She thought about that word, tired, the particular tiredness of someone who has carried a thing for a long time and has decided they cannot carry it anymore. She understood it. She closed the notebook. She went to the window and stood looking at the garden in the rain. The cherry tree was dark wet, its leaves holding the rain, the drops falling from the tips of the branches in slow, irregular rhythms. Her grandmother had been gone for 4 years. She thought about what her grandmother would make of all this, not the legal machinery, not the strategy, but the larger shape of it, the land still sitting on the eastern edge of the city, 12 acres of it, waiting, the graph paper plans in the lockbox, the letter she had written and the one that came back, and the 14 years of quiet holding that had followed. She thought she would not be surprised by any of this. She thought she would make tea and say, "Keep going." Sarah went to the kitchen. She made tea. She stood at the window with it, in the house that was becoming hers, in the life that was becoming something she had not planned but which felt, in its difficulty and its precision and its strangeness, entirely like her own. Outside, the rain continued. The city ran with it. The land on the eastern edge sat quiet, as it had always sat, patient as the woman who had held it for 3 generations, waiting for what came next. The financial records on her father arrived on a Thursday. Grace sent them through in a compressed file with a note that said, "Loan cleared 32 days before the wedding. Lender, a subsidiary of CF Capital. Amount, £412,000. Sarah opened the file. She sat with the number. £412,000. The land her grandmother had held for 3 generations, that her grandmother had refused to sell at any price, that had been taken from Sarah in a stack of misdirected paperwork, valued at £412,000 in debt clearance. She thought about what the land was actually worth. The eastern side of the city had changed in the years since her grandmother acquired it. The area was not what it had been. 12 acres of clean-titled land in that location would be valued, by any independent assessor, at several times that figure. Her father had taken below market value. He had taken what he needed, which was everything he had, and he had not asked for more, and he had not argued the price. He had simply said yes. She sent Grace a reply. Add it to the file, all of it. Grace replied, "Already in. I've also been contacted by the court. The preliminary hearing is in 6 weeks. They're asking whether a mediated settlement is being considered. Sarah replied, "Not at this time. We proceed to hearing." She closed her laptop. She went downstairs. She stood in the kitchen for a while, not doing anything in particular, just standing in the room that had become familiar to her in ways she had not expected. The exact sound of the kettle, the way the afternoon light came through the window at 4 o'clock, Henry's arrangement of the counter that she had adopted as her own without ever deciding to. She was thinking about her father. She called him on Friday evening. She used her regular phone this time. She called him from the kitchen island after Damien had gone to his study, and the house was quiet. He answered on the second ring. His voice had a particular quality she had not heard before. Not guilty, not defensive, something that was more tired than either of those things. She thought, he knows the filing has been made. He's been waiting. She said, "Dad." He said, "Sarah." A silence. He said, "I was going to call you." She said, "I know." He said, "I want to explain." She said, "You don't have to explain. I have the financial records. I know about the loan." He was quiet, the quiet of someone who has prepared to defend a position and finds they have been relieved of the need. He said, "I was in trouble. Real trouble. I had borrowed against the business years ago, and the interest had grown, and the bank was making moves. I didn't have anywhere to." She said, "She found you." He said, "She came to me." Yes. She had done her research. She knew about the debt. She made me an offer. She said, "You didn't tell me." He said, "I know." She said, "You let me sign papers I didn't understand. You sent me into a marriage that was built to take what belonged to me." He said, I told myself, that you would have a good life, that the Cole family had resources, that the land was sitting doing nothing." She said, "It was not sitting doing nothing, Dad. It was waiting. That's different." He was very quiet. She said, "Grandma refused that offer 14 years ago. You knew she refused it. You knew what it meant to her." He said, "Sarah." She said, "I'm not calling to punish you. I'm calling to tell you that I know all of it, and that the hearing is in 6 weeks, and that you may be called to give a statement about the meeting with Celestine 18 months before my wedding." He said, "I'll give it." It was said without hesitation, and the lack of hesitation told her something, that he had already decided this, before she called, that this was what he had been waiting to say. He said, "I'll give whatever statement is needed. I'll tell them everything." She said, "I know it will have consequences for you." He said, "I know." She said, "All right." She ended the call. She sat with the phone in her hand for a long moment. Then she put it on the counter and got up and opened the kitchen door to the garden and stood in the evening air, which was warm and still, the last of the light in the sky. She had not cried in the hotel room. She had not cried in any of the months since. She did not cry now. She simply stood in the open doorway with the garden in front of her and the house behind her, and let the evening be what it was, the particular completeness of a day at its end, which does not need anything from you except to acknowledge it. She heard Damien on the stairs. She heard him come into the kitchen. She heard him stop when he found the door open and her standing in it. He said, "Are you all right?" She said, "I called my father." He came and stood beside her in the open doorway, not touching, simply there, in the same doorway, looking at the same garden. He said, "And?" She said, "He's going to give a statement." He said, "That's good." She said, "Yes." They stood there for a while, the two of them in the doorway, and the garden was green in the last light, and the cherry tree was dark against the sky, and neither of them said anything else for a while because there was nothing useful to say, and they had both, in their different ways, learned to stop filling silences with words they didn't mean. He said eventually, "I spoke to my solicitor today." She said, "About?" He said, "I asked about the possibility of me filing a separate action, against my mother, for the use of my witness signature in a document whose nature I was not disclosed." She turned and looked at him. He said, "She used me, the same as she used you, and I've been sitting with that all week, and I think she needs to understand that I know what she did, not just to you, to both of us." She said, "That's your decision to make." He said, "I know, I've made it." The last of the light was almost gone. The garden had gone the color of deep water, blue-green, the shapes of things still visible but softened. She said, "She'll fight you on it." He said, "I know that." She said, "She'll say you're being influenced by your wife." He said, "She'll say a lot of things. She's very good at that." He turned and went back into the kitchen. She stayed in the doorway for another moment. Then she came in and closed the door and stood at the kitchen island. She said, "The preliminary hearing is in 6 weeks." He said, I know. Grace's office sent my solicitor the schedule. She said, your mother's legal team will try to delay. They'll file procedural challenges. He said, probably. She said, Grace says they'll fail. The documentation is too complete. He said, I believe her. He put the kettle on. She watched him move around the kitchen with the ease of someone in a space they know well, the exact reach for the mugs, the familiar drawer for the teaspoons, and she thought about the months that had produced this ease, the months she had spent in a different room watching and learning and building, and how the building had included, somewhere along the way, this, two people in a kitchen at the end of a long day, making tea without asking if the other wanted some because by now they already knew. He put a mug in front of her. He sat on the other side of the island with his own. He said, what happens to the land when you get it back? She said, I build what my grandmother planned. He said, the library and the clinic. She said, and the market. She had a small market in the plans too, local traders. He said, that's a significant build. She said, I have some capital. Not enough. I'd need investors. He looked at her over his mug. He said, I know some people. She said, I'm aware of that. He said, I'd like to help, if that's something you'd want. She looked at him. She thought about what wanting meant in this context, and what help meant, and how those two things sat alongside the other things she was still in the process of deciding about him. She said, let me get the land first. He said, of course. They drank their tea. The kitchen was quiet and warm. Outside, the garden was completely dark now, the shapes of things invisible, just the sound of the summer night coming in under the door. She said, Damien. He said, yes. She said, when I moved into this house, into the sitting room, that first night, did you know that you'd been wrong? He was quiet for a moment, not defensive, just thinking. He said, I knew I'd said what I said in the hotel. I told myself it was honest, that it was better than pretending. He turned the mug in his hands. He said, I didn't know yet how wrong. I think I've been understanding it in stages, since then, how wrong it was, and what wrong actually costs. She said, it cost a sitting room. He said, it cost more than that. She said, yes. He said, I'm sorry, Sarah. I've said it before. I'll keep saying it for as long as it takes to mean something. She said, it already means something. He looked at her. She held the look, not giving anything, not taking anything back, just letting it be there, between them, the space between I'm sorry and whatever comes after it, which is not forgiveness so much as the possibility of something new being built where the damage was. She put her mug in the sink. She said goodnight. She went upstairs. She lay in her room, the one she had decorated herself, in the house that had come to feel like hers, and looked at the ceiling in the dark and thought about 6 weeks. The preliminary hearing, the documentation, Douglas's statement, her father's statement, Grace's careful and complete legal architecture, Celestine's contesting grounds, which were weak and which Grace said would fail, though failing in law is never as quick or as neat as it sounds. She thought about 12 acres of land on the eastern edge of the city, sitting in the darkness the same as this ceiling was sitting in the darkness, patient as everything her grandmother had ever been. She thought about graph paper and a woman's handwriting and a building that had never been built. She closed her eyes. She slept. 6 weeks. She had done harder things in less time with fewer resources, and the resources she had now, the documentation, the solicitor, the statements, the history, the pattern and the intent and the 14-year chain of it, were the most complete things she had ever built. She thought, on the edge of sleep, about what her grandmother would say. She heard, quite clearly, the answer. Keep going. The procedural challenges came the following week, exactly as Grace had predicted. Celestine's legal team filed 2 of them. The first contested the chain of beneficial ownership documentation on the grounds that some of the intercompany transfer records had been obtained through informal inquiry rather than formal discovery, which was technically true and legally irrelevant, as Grace had anticipated. The second was an attempt to exclude Douglas's statement as biased, given his history of financial dispute with the Cole estate. Grace filed responses to both within 48 hours. Sarah read them on the Saturday morning, sitting at the desk, drinking the coffee she had made herself, because she was always awake before Henry. The responses were very good. Clear, precise, anticipating the counter-arguments before they were made, the way Grace always worked, building a room that had no doors the other side could open. She sent Grace a message. These are excellent. Grace replied, I've been waiting for this case for about 4 months. I've had time to prepare. Sarah smiled. She put the phone down and finished her coffee. The week that followed was one of the quietest of all the weeks she had spent in this house, and the quiet was the specific kind that comes when you have done everything that can be done, and are waiting for something that is no longer in your hands. She worked on the logistics firm. She spoke with Grace on Wednesday, briefly, because there was nothing substantial to report. She gardened on Saturday afternoon, which she had not done before but which turned out to be exactly the right kind of work for a week of waiting. Physical, concrete, requiring attention, but not the kind of attention that depletes. Damien gardened with her. She had not asked him. He appeared after lunch with his coat on and a pair of gloves and said, "What needs doing?" She said, "The hedge at the far end." He cut the hedge. She cleared the beds along the south wall. They worked without talking for 2 hours, in a comfortable and slightly surprising way, and when they were done they both stood back and looked at the garden, which looked distinctly better, and he said, "That's improved things." She said, "Yes." She made tea. They drank it standing in the garden. He told her about the development project on the south side, which had moved into the planning stage, and was giving him what he described as the particular pleasure of a problem you can see all the way around. She asked questions. He answered them. She mentioned a financial structure she had seen used in a similar project 3 years ago that might be applicable, and he said, "I hadn't thought of that," and wrote it down on his phone. They went inside. At dinner he said, "I want to ask you something and I need you to know you don't have to answer." She said, "Ask." He said, "If the hearing goes the way Grace thinks it will, when you have the land back, are you planning to stay here?" The question was specific and honest and direct, and she received it the same way. She said, "I haven't decided." He said, "Fair." She said, "Have you thought about what you want?" He said, "Yes." She said, "And?" He looked at her across the dinner table. He said, "I want you to stay. I want to be better than I was at the beginning. I want to see what this is, what we are, when it's not surrounded by everything that's been surrounding it." She said, "That's a very specific answer." He said, "I've had time to think about it." She looked at him. She thought about the night in the bridal suite and the flat, certain voice he had used and the sitting room door and the months that had followed. She thought about the bench in the garden and the kitchen at dusk and the way he made tea for 2 without asking. She thought about the statement he had given without being asked to. She said, "I want to see what this is too." He said, "Okay." She said, "That's not a decision, it's a direction." He said, "I understand that." She said, "All right." They finished dinner. She washed the plates. He dried them, which he had never done before, and she did not mention it. They put them away, and then she went to the study, and he went to the sitting room, and the house was quiet and warm around both of them. She opened the grocery notebook. She turned past the lists and the notes and the entries. Douglas knows, he gave it, filed, he's tired, all of it, to the first blank page she'd reached in weeks. She wrote, "Direction." She closed the notebook. She sat at the desk in the quiet house with the lamp making a small warm circle on the wood, and outside the summer evening was blue, and the garden was still, and the cherry tree was full in its leaf, completely and entirely itself. The preliminary hearing arrived on a Tuesday. Sarah had not been required to attend. Grace had said her presence was not necessary for this stage, that it was largely procedural, and that Grace would represent her interests directly. But she went anyway, which Grace did not argue with because she had by now come to understand that Sarah went where things of consequence were happening, and that this was simply who she was. The hearing room was smaller than she had imagined, a civil courtroom, plain and functional, with no drama in it. Celestine was not there, which was notable. Her legal team was represented by a solicitor named Whitfield who had the alert, compressed energy of someone managing multiple things simultaneously. Grace was calm, organized, her papers in neat stacks. Sarah sat in the public gallery. She wore the same coat she had worn on her first visit to Grace's office, which was a choice she had made consciously, the way she made most choices. Damien sat beside her. She had not asked him to come. He had knocked on her bedroom door that morning at 7:15, which was unusual, and when she opened it he was in his work clothes and said, "I'm coming with you." She had said, "You don't have to." He had said, "I know." He was there. He sat beside her in the public gallery and she looked at the proceedings, and he looked at the proceedings, and their shoulders were close enough that she was aware of the exact distance between them, which was not very much distance. The procedural challenges were addressed first. The court considered both, briefly, and dismissed them both. The judge cited the quality of documentation and the completeness of the ownership chain. Grace's responses were referenced as thorough. Celestine's legal team requested a mediated settlement, which the judge acknowledged. Grace stated that her client was not excluding settlement but required any offer to be made in writing and to include full return of the transferred asset. The hearing was adjourned to allow for settlement discussion, with a hard deadline of 3 weeks before the full hearing would proceed. 3 weeks. In the car on the way back, Damien said, "She'll settle." Sarah said, "You think so?" He said, "The procedural challenges failed. The documentation is what Grace says it is. My mother is many things, but she knows when a position is not sustainable." Sarah said, "She'll put conditions on it." He said, "Probably. What conditions won't you accept?" She thought about it. She said, "I won't accept confidentiality over the company history. The 14-year record stays on file." He said, "She'll fight that." She said, "I know." He said, "Is it important enough to go to full hearing over?" She said, "Yes." He looked at her. She said, "If I close the record, someone else won't know it happened. Someone else won't have access to the pattern when they need it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's for other people, future people." She said, "Yes." He said, "Right." He looked at the road for a while. Then he said, "I'll talk to her." She said, "You don't have to do that." He said, "I know, I want to." He called Celestine that evening. Sarah was in the study. She did not listen to the call, though she could have. She sat at her desk and worked on the logistics firm's annual projection, which was going well, and she let the call happen in whatever room it happened in. He came to the study afterward. He knocked. She said, "Come in." He said, "She'll return the land. Full transfer back to your name. She won't put conditions on the public record." Sarah was quiet. He said, "I told her the alternative was a full hearing, where Douglas and your father both give evidence, and that I would also be in the hearing giving my account of my witness signature and what I was told about the documents." She said, "What did she say?" He said, "She said I was making a mistake." She said, "And?" He said, "I told her I had been making a mistake for several years and I was trying to stop." Sarah looked at him. He was standing in the doorway. They always met in doorways, she thought, the two of them, with an expression she had learned over months of looking. Not the man from the hotel room. Not the managed, armored face of someone who has decided the outcome in advance. Something else. Someone she was still learning. She said, "Thank you." He said, "The settlement paperwork will come through Grace's office." She said, "I know." He said, "Are you all right?" She said, "I think so." He said, "Good." He left. She sat at the desk. She picked up the grocery notebook. She found the blank page where she had written direction. Under it she wrote, "She's returning it." And then, after a pause, 3 generations, plus 1. She put the notebook down. She opened the folder in the bottom drawer of the desk. She took out the lockbox key, opened it, and took out the folder of her grandmother's documents. She unfolded the graph paper plans, the community building, the library side, the clinic wing, the small market off the East End, and laid them flat on the desk. She looked at them for a long time. The handwriting was her grandmother's. The measurements were precise. The rooms were sized for people, not for appearances. The clinic examination rooms large enough to be dignified. The library reading room wide-windowed. The market stalls arranged so that the morning light would come in from the east. Her grandmother had designed a building for the morning light. She had done it on graph paper at a kitchen table 40 years ago. She had never had the money to build it, and she had held the land anyway, and refused the offers, and written the letters, and waited. Sarah was going to build it. She was not sure yet of all the ways she would do it, the investors, the planning permissions, the years of construction, but she was sure of the building itself, its dimensions and its purpose, and the particular quality of its morning light, which was exactly what her grandmother had intended. She folded the plans carefully, the same way she always folded them. She put them back in the folder. She put the folder back in the lockbox. She locked it. She turned off the desk lamp. She sat in the dark study for a moment, the house quiet around her, the city outside going on doing what it always did. She thought about her grandmother. She thought, "I've got it back." She thought she heard, very clearly, in the particular register of someone speaking from a long way away, the answer. "Good girl. Now build." The settlement agreement arrived on a Thursday, 18 days after the preliminary hearing. Grace sent it through at noon. Sarah read it at the desk in the study, beginning to end, twice, the way she read every document she signed now, completely, in order, with the particular attention of someone who has learned the precise cost of missing a page. The terms were clean. The land was to be transferred back to Sarah Adayeze, her full name, not her married name, within 21 working days. Meridian Holdings was to be dissolved, with the dissolution costs borne by CF Capital Partners. The documentary record of the transfer and the challenge, including the beneficial ownership chain, would remain on public file. No confidentiality clause. There was one addition she had not expected. Celestine's legal team had included a paragraph acknowledging the original acquisition attempts made between the Cole Property Development Company and Patience Adese, and confirming that no further claim against the Adese land title, or any future development on that land, would be made by any entity in which CF Cole had a beneficial interest. It was, Grace said on the phone that afternoon, more than they had asked for. Sarah said, she wanted it over. Grace said, she wanted it over cleanly. There's a difference. This version leaves less room for a return challenge in 5 years. Sarah said, she's accepted she lost. Grace said, yes. A pause. Grace said, how are you feeling? Sarah thought about the question. She said, I'll let you know when I sign it. She signed it on Friday morning. She used her own pen, the one that had been her grandmother's, which she had carried in her bag since the day she moved into the house on Kensington Lane. She signed at every flag tab, all of them, and she knew what every one of them meant. She sent it back to Grace. Grace sent back a confirmation. The 21-day clock began. She put the pen on the desk. She sat in the study. The morning light was coming through the window at the particular angle it came at this time of year, falling across the desk in a wide band. She picked up her phone. She called Grace. She said, thank you. Grace said, you did this. Sarah said, we did this. Grace said, yes, but I want to be clear, I've done difficult cases. This one was not difficult because of the law. It was difficult because of what it required you to carry for the months it took. That part was all you. Sarah said, you carried a lot of it too. Grace said, I did my job. You did something else. They stayed on the phone for a moment without saying anything. Then Grace said, dinner. When this is completed, I'm taking you to dinner. Sarah said, yes. She hung up. She sat in the study with the morning light on the desk and the pen that had been her grandmother's, and the house around her, and the life she had built inside it, piece by piece, over months of attention and patience, and a kind of stubbornness that had come to her the same way the pen had, inherited. She went downstairs. Henry was in the kitchen. He looked up when she came in, with the particular alertness of someone who has been watching a situation develop from close quarters for months, and knows when a moment has weight. She said, the settlement is signed. The land is coming back. He said, good. That was all. No performance, no elaborate response, just, good. The most efficient word for the occasion, which was exactly what she would have chosen. She made coffee. He went back to what he was doing. The kitchen was warm and ordinary, and she stood in it and let it be warm and ordinary for a while. Damien texted her at 11 from wherever he was. Grace's office sent me the settlement confirmation. Well done. She replied. Thank you. He replied. Dinner tonight? She looked at the message for a moment. Then she replied. Yes. He came home at 6. He had been to a restaurant, not the kind with a dress code, just a neighborhood place 2 streets over that she had walked past several times and noticed for its small tables and the particular warm quality of the light in the window. They walked there, which was the first time they had walked anywhere together. The evening was mild, the street was quiet at this hour, the day's noise settling into the particular softness of a city in the early evening, when the light is at the angle that makes everything look slightly more than it is. He said, without preamble, I'm glad it worked out. She said, are you? He said, I'm glad she didn't beat you. She looked at him. He said, I know she's my mother. I also know what she did. Those 2 things are both true, and I've stopped trying to make them sit comfortably together. She said, that's a mature position. He said, I've had a lot of time in the last few months to get to it. They walked. The restaurant was small and warm, with the kind of menu that doesn't need to be long because what's on it is good. They ordered without ceremony. They ate. He told her about the South Side development. The planning application had been approved that afternoon. He had not told her until now, saving it, which was a small and deliberate thing that she noticed. He described the approval with the satisfaction of someone who has worked toward a specific outcome and reached it, and she found she understood that satisfaction completely, which was a different kind of recognition than the recognition of watching someone read a room. She said, when does the build start? He said, next spring, if everything holds. She said, what could go wrong? He said, supply chain, weather, the particular chaos of construction. She said, are you managing it yourself? He said, I am now. I had a project manager who left last month. I've been covering it. She said, I know someone who might be a fit. She managed the Alderton rebuild on the north side. Very good. He said, Would she be interested? Sarah said, I can ask, if you want me to. He said, yes, if you're willing to recommend her, I'd trust your judgment. It was said simply, without making anything of it. She filed it in a different category than the things she had been filing for months. Not intelligence, not data, something else. Something she was still learning the name for. They walked home. The evening had gone dark, the city lit up the way it lit up at this hour, warm and layered, and they walked in a comfortable quiet that was not the silence of people who have nothing to say, but the silence of people who have said enough for now. At the front door she found a card in the post box. She looked at the handwriting, and knew it before she opened it. Her father's handwriting. She opened it standing at the door while Damien went inside. It was a small card, shop-bought, simple. Inside, in his handwriting, it said, I know there is nothing adequate I can say right now. I am proud of you, in the way that people are proud when they know they had very little to do with the outcome. Your grandmother would be proud. I am sorry, Sarah. I will keep saying it. She stood at the door for a moment. Then she put the card in her coat pocket, went inside, hung up her coat, and went to the kitchen. Damien was making tea. She sat at the island. He put a mug in front of her. She said, My father sent a card. He said, Will you see him? She said, Not yet. He said, But eventually. She said, Yes. He's going to give the statement at the full filing, the record that goes on file. After that, I think. He said, That's a reasonable way to do it. She said, I think so. They drank their tea. The kitchen was what it had become, warm and familiar, and theirs in the particular way that spaces become yours not through ownership, but through use, through the accumulation of ordinary evenings. She said, I want to tell you something. He put down his mug. She said, When I moved in here, into the sitting room, that first night, I already knew about the land. Grace had already called me. I already had the outline of what I was going to do. He said, I know that now. She said, I want you to know that what happened after, the household accounts, the conversations, the things I learned about your family, I didn't plan most of it. The legal part was planned. The rest was consequence. He said, the rest meaning us. She said, yes. He was quiet for a moment. He said, I don't think it matters. I mean, I understand why you're telling me. I think you want me to know that you didn't set out to use me. She said, I didn't. He said, I know that. I think I've known it for a while. You're very consistent, Sarah. The way you pay attention, the way you do things. It's the same whether you're dealing with the household accounts or the legal filing or this. She said, this. He said, us. She looked at him. He said, you're doing the same thing with this that you do with everything else. Looking at it completely, not rushing it, not making it something it isn't yet. She said, does that frustrate you? He said, honestly, yes. Also, I think I'd rather have that than the alternative. I'd rather you take your time and be certain than move fast and be wrong. She said, I'm not going to be wrong. He looked at her. She said, I don't know what this is yet, but I'm not going to be wrong about it. He was quiet. Then he said, okay. She finished her tea. She said goodnight. She went upstairs. She lay in her room and thought about the settlement and the 21 days and the graph paper plans in the lockbox and everything that would need to happen after the land was back in her name. The planning process, the capital, the building. It was a large and complicated thing, and she was looking forward to it with the specific appetite she had for large and complicated things that required sustained attention to carry through. She also thought about what she had said at the kitchen island. I'm not going to be wrong about it. She had not planned to say that. It had arrived in her mouth fully formed and left before she could evaluate it, which was unusual enough that she paid attention to it now, in the dark, in the room that had become entirely hers. She thought about whether it was true. She was not a person who made decisions about feeling the same way she made decisions about everything else, which was to say she could not fully analyze this one, because feeling resists analysis, and the interesting thing about Damien Cole was that he had turned out to be someone she could not fully see from a distance. That the closer she had come, the more there was to see, which was the opposite of how she had initially expected it to be, and was the more interesting outcome of the two. She was not going to be wrong about it. She was sure about that at least. She went to sleep. In 21 working days, the land would come back to her, and after that, all of it. Everything her grandmother had waited for, drawn out in pencil on graph paper, measuring the morning light. She was awake early. She was always awake early. She went to the study and she began to work. The 21 days moved in the way that days move when something important is happening at the far edge of them. Not slowly, not quickly, but with a peculiar texture, each day more defined than usual because they were all being counted. On the fourth day, the logistics firm director called to tell her that the annual projection she had completed had been used in a funding application, and the application had succeeded. He asked if she would consider continuing in a part-time capacity as a retained financial consultant. She said she would consider it and came back to him with a structure the following morning that divided her time in a way that worked for both of them. On the seventh day, she met with a planning consultant recommended by Grace, a woman named Audrey who specialized in community development projects and who met Sarah at the land itself, which was the first time Sarah had stood on it since she was a child visiting her grandmother on a summer afternoon. The land was flat and large and quiet at its edges, with the city just visible on the skyline, and Audrey walked it with Sarah and said, "This is a good site. Planning should be straightforward. The community benefit component will help." Sarah stood at the eastern edge and thought about her grandmother standing in this same place, looking at this same skyline, holding graph paper. She said, "I have detailed plans, drawn up by the original landowner. They'll need some updating for current building codes, but the layout is complete." Audrey said, "I'd like to see them." She did not take the graph paper plans to the site meeting. She had photographed every page of them and sent those to Audrey, preserving the originals in the lockbox. Audrey reviewed the photographs that evening and called Sarah the next morning. She said, "The original plans are very well thought out. The building orientation is clever. Whoever designed this understood the site. The clinic wing placement makes particularly good use of the natural drainage." Sarah said, "My grandmother designed them." Audrey said, "She was good." Sarah said, "Yes." On the 10th day, she had dinner with Grace. They went to a restaurant in the center of the city that Grace chose, and over 2 hours, they talked about the case, and about the work they would do on the planning permissions, and about things that had nothing to do with either of those things. Grace's brother's new baby, a film they had both seen years ago, and come to completely different conclusions about, whether the city's particular brand of gray weather was something you learned to love, or simply stopped noticing. Sarah said, "I've missed this. Just talking." Grace said, "You've been somewhat occupied." Sarah said, "Yes. But also, I think I went very inside myself this year, more than usual." Grace said, "That seems like a reasonable response to what this year has been." Sarah said, "Yes." Grace said, "Are you coming back out?" Sarah thought about it. She said, "I think so, in stages." Grace looked at her. She said, "And Damien?" Sarah said, "That's one of the stages." Grace said, "I liked him more than I expected to, from the legal file." Sarah said, "What did you expect?" Grace said, "I expected someone who was simply his mother's tool. What the file showed me was someone who gave a statement that he knew would cost him something and gave it anyway." Sarah said, "Yes." Grace said, "That matters." Sarah said, "I know." They ordered dessert. Grace talked about a case she was starting the following month, a contentious estate matter that promised to be complicated. Sarah asked questions. They stayed until the restaurant began to clear. On the 14th day, Celestine sent a card. It arrived in the same cream envelopes as the first one, with the same large handwriting. Sarah opened it, standing at the kitchen island with Henry pretending not to notice. The card said, "I hope you will allow time for things to settle between our families. I recognize that I have made decisions that caused harm. I am not accustomed to saying that. I am saying it. No signature, just C." Sarah read it twice. She thought about all the things this card was and was not. It was not an apology in any complete sense. It was not a request for contact or a reaching out in any personal direction. It was a statement from a woman who was not accustomed to losing and had lost, and who had found a very small way to acknowledge it without naming it directly. She put the card in the desk drawer with the first one. She did not reply. She was not ready to reply. She did not know if she would ever reply, and she did not put pressure on herself to decide. On the 18th day, her father came to the house. She had not invited him. He rang the bell at 3 in the afternoon on a day when Damien was out. Henry answered and came to find Sarah in the study and said, with the careful neutrality he had perfected over months, "Your father is at the door." She said, "Give him tea and put him in the sitting room." She sat in the study for 10 minutes, not preparing what to say, not rehearsing, just sitting with the fact of him being there, the fact of this moment arriving, which she had known would arrive in some form at some point, and which was now here. She went downstairs. He was in the sitting room with his tea. He was thinner than she remembered, which was what guilt sometimes does to people. He stood up when she came in. He said, "I should have called." She said, "Yes." She sat. He sat. The room was quiet. He said, "I needed to see you. I know I have no right to ask for anything. She said, you don't. He said, I know. He held the tea mug. He looked at it rather than at her, which was its own kind of honesty. Not being able to look was not the same as not caring. He said, your grandmother gave me this look once, when I'd done something I knew was wrong. She didn't say anything. She just looked at me until I said it myself. Sarah said, what did you say? He said, I said I was sorry, and I wouldn't do it again. I was 24. I had borrowed money from her without asking and spent it on something stupid. He looked up. He said, she forgave me. She didn't make a production of it. She just said all right and made tea. Sarah looked at him. She said, I'm not there yet. He said, I know. She said, but I'm not getting there. He said, that's more than I deserve. She said, yes. He nodded. He finished his tea. He put the mug on the table and stood up and looked at her with the face of a man who is carrying something very heavy and knows that the carrying is the appropriate punishment and is not asking to be relieved of it. He said, I'm going to give the statement, whatever they need. She said, Grace will contact you. He said, good. He left. She heard the front door. She heard his car. Then quiet. She went to the kitchen. She put the kettle on. She stood at the window and looked at the garden. She thought about her grandmother's look, the one that made a 24-year-old say it himself. She thought she probably had that look. She thought she had probably used it on her father this afternoon without knowing it. She thought, she's in me everywhere. She made tea. She took it to the study. She opened the grocery notebook to the last entry and wrote, under direction and 3 generations plus 1, and she's returning it. Dad came. He's carrying it. Not ready, but getting there. Under it, after a moment, she wrote something she had not written before. I think I am too. She put the notebook away. She opened her laptop. She had work to do. On the 21st working day, Grace called at 11 in the morning. She said, it's done. The transfer is complete. The land is in your name. Sarah put the phone down. She sat at the desk. She picked up the pen that had been her grandmother's, the one she used for important things, and she held it in her hand for a moment, not writing anything. The land was hers. 12 acres on the eastern edge of the city, clean titled, no debt, 3 generations old, held through 40 years of refusals and 1 year of fighting, and everything her grandmother had put into it, and everything Sarah had put in since. Hers. She called Damien. He picked up on the second ring. She said, it's done. He said, congratulations, Sarah. She said, thank you. He said, dinner tonight. She said, yes. She called Grace and said the same 2 words and heard in Grace's voice the particular satisfaction of someone who does difficult work and has done it well. Then she called Audrey, who already knew from the registration system but said it anyway. I saw it come through. Congratulations. Let's get the planning application moving. She put the phone on the desk. She sat in the quiet study. The morning light was on the desk. The grocery notebook was in the drawer. The graph paper plans were in the lockbox. She opened the lockbox. She unfolded the plans and laid them flat, the same as she had done the night the settlement was signed. She looked at them the same way, with full attention, from the beginning to the end. The library, the clinic, the market off the East End, the windows in the reading room, sized for light, the stalls arranged for the morning. Her grandmother had sat at a table with graph paper and pencil, and designed a building for the people she loved, in a place she had held at a cost most people could not have sustained. She had not built it. She had given the land to Sarah instead. Sarah was going to build it. She was going to build it in her grandmother's measurements, with Audrey's planning application and investors she was already beginning to identify, and a builder she had not chosen yet, but would. She was going to build it on land that now had her name on the title, clean and permanent, and she was going to open its doors to the eastern edge of the city that her grandmother had loved. It would take time. 2 years, probably 3. It would be complicated in all the ways that large projects are complicated, and she would manage every complication with the same attention she had brought to everything else. She folded the plans carefully. She put them back in the lockbox. She locked it. She went downstairs. She walked through the kitchen and out into the garden and stood under the cherry tree in the middle of the day and looked up through the leaves at the sky, which was a clear and ordinary blue. She stood there for a while. She was not sure what she was doing exactly. Not celebrating. Celebration required an audience of some kind. Not mourning. There was nothing to mourn, except what her grandmother had not lived to see, and her grandmother was past the point of needing things to be seen. She was simply standing in the garden in the middle of the day, holding the fact of the land in her body the way you hold something that has come back to you after a long absence, carefully, aware of its weight, aware that it is real. She heard the back door. Henry came out with a cup of coffee. He set it on the bench without saying anything. He went back inside. She went and sat on the bench. She picked up the coffee. She looked at the garden. She thought, good. She thought, now build. The planning application was submitted on a Wednesday in September, 11 months after the wedding. Audrey filed it at the council offices at 10 in the morning and texted Sarah at 10:14. Submitted. Sarah was in a meeting with the logistics firm director at the time, and she read the text under the table and allowed herself one quiet breath before continuing the conversation about third-quarter projections. She had told almost nobody. Grace knew. Damien knew. Audrey, obviously. A woman named Frances, whom Damien had introduced her to at a dinner 2 weeks earlier, and who turned out to be both a retired architect and deeply interested in community healthcare. Frances had looked at the photographs of the original plans and said, in the way that people with genuine expertise say things, that the clinic wing design was ahead of its time for when it was drawn. Sarah had liked that very much. She had also, more quietly, begun to talk to potential investors, not formally, not with a pitch document or a presentation. She talked to people the way she had always gathered information, directly, in ordinary conversation, in the spaces where people were comfortable. She had learned from the first 18 months of her career that money follows clarity, that people who have capital are not difficult to talk to about where to place it if you are precise about what you are building, and honest about what it will cost. She was precise. She was honest. She had 3 conversations in September that were not commitments but were the thing that comes before commitments, which is attention, and attention was where everything she had ever built had started. The planning process would take between 12 and 16 weeks, Audrey estimated. Standard timeline for a community development of this scale, with the community benefit classification likely to smooth some of the more complex assessments. Sarah had 12 to 16 weeks, therefore, to finish building the financial structure. She worked on it in the mornings in the study, after the household had begun its day and before the consulting work started. She had a spreadsheet, not in the grocery notebook, not hidden, that lived on her laptop under a file name that accurately described it, because she was no longer in the phase of her life where things needed to be hidden. Damien saw the spreadsheet once. He looked at it for a few seconds and then said, "Your capital stack is missing a subordinated debt layer." She looked at him. He said, "Between the equity and the grant funding, if you put a subordinated debt instrument in there, you reduce the equity dilution and you get a more favorable rate on the senior debt." She said, "Show me." He sat down at the desk, her desk, the first time he had sat at her desk, and drew it out on a piece of paper. She watched his hands, the quick, precise way he moved through the structure, the ease of someone who has done this many times. She asked 2 questions. He answered them. She looked at the drawing. She said, "Yes, that's better." He said, "I know a lender who does this kind of instrument for social impact projects. If you want, I can make an introduction." She said, "Yes." He made the introduction the next day. She had a first call with the lender the following week, a man named Arthur who ran a small impact finance firm and who asked exactly the right questions and whom Sarah liked immediately in the way you like people who are efficient and honest and don't mistake either for coldness. After the call, she went to find Damien in the kitchen. She said, "Arthur's good." He said, "I thought you'd think so." She said, "Thank you." He said, "You're welcome." This had become their texture. The small, practical exchanges that were also something else, offers and acceptances so embedded in the ordinary that they barely paused around them. She thought about this sometimes, how the texture of a relationship is built not in the large moments but in the small ones, in the show me and the thank you, in who puts the kettle on and who cuts the hedge and who appears in the doorway without being asked, and stays. October arrived. The planning application was under review. Arthur's firm was doing preliminary due diligence. She had 2 other investors in early conversation. She continued the consulting work, which she had expanded to a second client, a small property management company whose accounts were surprisingly interesting. She gardened on Saturdays. She called Grace every 10 days or so for reasons that had stopped being purely professional. She called her father on a Sunday evening. It was the first call she had made to him since the one in which she had told him about the filing, and it arrived without a specific reason, which was the reason. She simply called. He answered. He said, "Sarah." His voice was careful, the voice of someone who has been waiting for a thing and doesn't want to show how much. She said, "I wanted to call, see how you are." He said, I'm well. I've been following the planning notices." She said, I thought you might. He said, the community building. It's exactly what she had in mind. She said, I know. He said, I'm glad you're doing it. A pause. She said, I want to talk. About everything. When I'm ready. He said, I'll be here. She said, I know, Dad. She hung up. She went to the kitchen. Damien was at the island with something he was reading, and he looked up when she came in, and she said, my father. And he said, how was it? And she said, fine. Getting there. He nodded. He went back to his reading. She made tea and sat across from him and did not read or work. Just sat in the warm kitchen in the ordinary October evening, which was ordinary in all the ways that mattered and in which nothing particular happened, and which she would remember for a long time for exactly that reason. 2 weeks later, the South Side development that Damien had been managing came into the news. Not in a dramatic way, it was not that kind of story. It appeared in a business publication, a brief article about approved planning permits in the city's southern quarter, with a photograph of the site and a quote from Damien about the project's timeline. She saw it on her phone during lunch and read it and then looked at the photograph of the site, which was just an empty lot behind a fence, and thought about the structural diagram he had drawn for her on the back of an envelope, the way the equity was layered. She texted him, saw the article, congratulations. He replied, thank you. Your project manager recommendation is very good, by the way. Nina. She stopped. She reread the message. His project manager recommendation. She had recommended someone to him weeks ago, the woman she had mentioned at dinner, but she had not mentioned a name. She had asked a colleague for a contact and forwarded the details. She had not checked the name. She clicked back through her messages from the time. There it was, the email she had forwarded. The contact name. Nina Fletcher. She sat with her phone. She thought about coincidence, and about the specific size of any city, and about the project manager colleague who had given her the contact, who knew a lot of people in construction management, and who would not have known the name was significant. She called Damien. He answered immediately. She said, the project manager. Is it the same Nina? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, yes. She said, did you know when you hired her? He said, she sent in her portfolio 2 months ago. I knew her work. It's very good. I hired her on the basis of the work. She said, does she know you know who I am? He said, I told her yes. When she came in to discuss the project, I thought it was the right thing to do. She said, and? He said, she said she hoped I was doing better than I deserved. Sarah sat with this for a moment. Then she said, that's fair. He said, I thought so. She said, how is she? He said, she seems well, competent, very direct. She said, good. She put the phone down. She sat in the study for a while, looking at the window, at the October light coming through in the particular way it did at this time of year. Lower, more amber, the light of a season settling toward its end. She thought about the way things move in a city, how people circle back, how what is done in the dark eventually comes around into the light, how Celestine had thought she was moving pieces on a board and had not understood that the pieces move too. She opened her laptop. She went back to the Capital Stack spreadsheet. She worked for 2 hours. The planning decision arrived on a Thursday in November, 14 weeks after the application was submitted. Grace texted her at 9 in the morning. Approved. Full approval, no conditions. Sarah was standing in the kitchen with coffee. She read the text. She put the phone face down on the counter. She picked it up. She read it again. Approved. Full approval, no conditions. She had known it was likely. Audrey had said the community benefit classification was strong, that the plans were good, that the site had no significant complications. She had known it was likely, and she had also held in the back of her awareness the possibility that it would not be, because she had learned this year more completely than she had ever known it before that the likely outcome is not always the actual one, and that you make plans and keep them ready, but you do not treat them as finished until they are finished. They were finished. She texted Grace. Thank you. She texted Audrey. I saw it. Thank you. She called Arthur and left a message. She sat at the island with her coffee going cold. Then she went upstairs and knocked on Damien's study door, which was the first time she had knocked on his door rather than the other way around. He said, come in. She came in. His room was organized differently from hers, more horizontal. Papers and screens where hers was vertical, shelves and files. She stood in the doorway and looked at him. She said, the planning is approved. He stood up. He came around the desk. He stood in front of her, not at the desk, not at the distance they usually kept, closer than that, close enough that she could see the exact expression on his face, which was not what she expected, and which she had no category for, and which she held very still to look at. He said, "Sarah." She said, "Yes." He said, "I'd like to take you to see it. The land, if you'd like to go." She said, "Now?" He said, "Whenever you want." She said, "Now." They drove to the eastern edge of the city, which was 35 minutes in November traffic. She directed him from memory, and then from the map when memory wasn't quite enough, and they parked on the road that ran along the southern edge of the site, and got out, and walked to where the gate was. A simple metal gate that she had a key for now, which was a new thing, the weight of the key in her pocket. She unlocked it. They went in. The land was flat and quiet, the city skyline just visible over the low buildings to the west. The sky above it the gray of November with the sun somewhere behind it, diffuse and even. The grass was long and the ground was soft and there was nothing on it except the shape of it, 12 acres of it, clean and clear. She walked toward the middle of it. She stopped. Damien stood beside her. He did not say anything, which was the correct thing. She stood on her grandmother's land in November and looked at the city skyline and thought, here, right here is where the reading room will be, with the windows facing east, and over there, the morning light will come in across the market stalls, and at the far end, the clinic. She thought about graph paper. She thought about her grandmother's handwriting, small and upright and very clear. She thought, you'd like this, standing here right now. You'd like this very much. She said out loud, I'm going to build it. Damien said, I know. She said, I'm going to need your help with the finance structure. He said, you have it. She said, and the contractor introduction. You know people. He said, I know people. She looked at the site. She looked at the skyline. She looked at the gray November sky. She said, she designed the windows for the morning light. He said, I know. Francis told me. She said it was very good for someone working without an architecture degree. Sarah said, she never needed a degree. She just needed to know how light moves. He said, yes. They stood on the land for a while. The wind moved through the long grass. Somewhere on the boundary a bird called once and then was quiet. She thought, this is where it starts. She thought, no, it started a long time ago. This is where it arrives. She turned and walked back toward the gate. He walked beside her. She locked the gate. She put the key in her pocket. She held the weight of it as they walked to the car. She thought about everything that had happened in a year. The wedding, the sitting room, the weeks of listening, the calls to Grace, the dinner at Celestine's, Douglas at the coffee table, her father on the phone, the filing, the preliminary hearing, the settlement, the 21 days, the key in her hand. She thought about what her grandmother would say about all of it. She thought the answer was probably, good, about time. She got in the car. Damien got in beside her. He started the engine. They drove back toward Kensington Lane. She did not look back at the land. She didn't need to. She knew exactly where it was and what it looked like and what it was going to become. She looked forward, at the road, at the city, at the particular quality of November light that turned everything the color of something that is about to change. December brought rain, and the final confirmation from Arthur's firm that the subordinated debt instrument was in place. Sarah called him on a Monday morning to confirm the terms. He was efficient and specific, the way she appreciated people being, and the call lasted 12 minutes and ended with 2 dates. A signing date in January and a drawdown date in February, which she wrote in the grocery notebook, not under a coded heading, but on a fresh page labeled simply, Build Dates. That evening she sent Francis the complete set of photographs of her grandmother's original plans, with a note asking if she would be willing to consult on the architectural update. Francis replied within the hour, I've been hoping you'd ask. They met the following Saturday, at the land. Francis brought her own copy of the photographs, annotated in pencil, with questions written in the margins in the precise handwriting of someone who has spent a lifetime thinking carefully about how buildings meet the people who use them. She walked the site with Sarah for 2 hours in the December cold, with a tape measure and a compass and a small notebook, and by the time they got back to the car, Francis had 3 pages of notes and a list of the 4 structural updates the plans would need to meet current building code, all of which she described as small, and none of which changed the fundamental design. She said, at the car, your grandmother understood something that a lot of architects miss. She designed for people at the edges of things. The clinic rooms are private but not institutional. The library is welcoming at the entrance but has quiet corners for people who need to disappear for a while. The market is generous. There's room to linger, room to sit, room to just be there. Sarah said. She used the library herself, and the market on Merton Road when she lived near there. Francis said, She designed from the inside of use. That's quite rare. Sarah drove home and spent the evening looking at the annotated photographs. She looked at her grandmother's pencil lines and Francis's pencil notes side by side on her phone. Two sets of precise attention, decades apart, applied to the same set of rooms, and felt something that she had no name for, which was fine, because not everything needed a name. She put the phone down. She went to the kitchen. Damien was at the island with paperwork from the Southside development, which was moving into its early build phase. He looked up. She said, "Francis is consulting on the design update." He said, "I thought she would." She said, "She says my grandmother designed from the inside of use." He looked at her. She said, "I think that's the best thing anyone has said about her work." He said, "It's a good phrase." She said, "Yes." She made tea. She sat across from him. He went back to his paperwork and she looked at her phone, not scrolling, just looking at the annotated photographs. And the kitchen was warm and the December rain was on the windows, and neither of them said anything else for a while, which was the texture of the long evenings they had been having lately, where the silence between them was not an absence but a presence, the kind that builds in a space when two people have stopped performing in it. She was thinking about what she wanted to say. She had been thinking about it for several weeks, working around it the way you work around something you are not yet sure of the shape of. She was sure of it now. She said, "Damien." He put down the paperwork. She said, "I want to stay here. I've decided." He was very still. She said, "Not because the land is here, not because of the build or the planning or any of that. I want to stay here because this is where I am and this is what this has become and I don't want to leave." He said, "Sarah." She said, "I'm not finished. I want to stay here, and I want to do this properly, which means we have to actually start, which means not two people existing in a house. Something else." He said, "Something else." She said, "Something with direction, which is what we said before, but I'm saying it differently now. Not, let's see what this is. I know what this is. I'm choosing it." He stood up. He came around the island. He stood in front of her, and he looked at her with the expression that had been building in him for months, the one she had no category for but had been watching come closer, and she looked back. He said, "I chose this a long time ago." She said, "I know. You're very transparent about some things." He said, "I know I am." She said, "It's one of the things I've decided I like." He put his hand out, palm up, on the island between them, an offer, uncomplicated. She put her hand in his. He said, "Hello." She said, "Hello." They stood in the kitchen for a moment, in the warm, ordinary room that had become theirs through use and through argument and through Sunday mornings and hedge cutting and shared spreadsheets and the particular stubbornness of two people who were each, in their different ways, too precise to accept something that was not actually what it appeared to be. She squeezed his hand once. She let it go. She picked up her tea. She said, "We're going to have a significant number of conversations." He said, "I know." She said, "About your mother. About what comes next with that." He said, "I've been thinking about it." She said, "And your father's estate. I've seen the structure. When I was doing the Cole Quarterly research. There are things in there that..." He said, "I know. I'd like your help with it." She said, "You have it." He said, "I know." She looked at him. He looked at her. The rain was still on the windows and the kitchen was still warm and outside the city was doing its December things, lights and cold and the particular energy of a year about to end. She said, "The build starts in February. Groundbreaking." He said, "I'll be there." She said, "I know." She finished her tea. She washed the mug. She said goodnight. And this time she said it differently than she had been saying it. Not the good night of a person returning to their own room, but the good night of a person who knows what they're returning to and is at peace with all of it. She went upstairs. She went to the study. She sat at the desk. She opened the grocery notebook. She looked at the pages, the entries from the beginning of all this, the word possible, the word direction, the crossing off of the list, the careful small letters tracking a year of attention and patience, and the particular kind of work that doesn't always look like work. She turned to the last used page. She wrote, "I'm staying." She closed the notebook. She locked the lockbox with the key. She turned off the lamp. She stood in the dark study for a moment, listening to the house, the rain on the windows, the distant sound of the city, the particular quiet of a building that is occupied by people who have found their way to something true. She went to her room. She lay in the dark. She thought about February, about the groundbreaking, about the building that was going to go up on 12 acres on the eastern edge of the city, in the measurements her grandmother had decided on, with the windows for the morning light. She thought about what it would look like when the reading room was open and someone was sitting in it. A person who needed to be somewhere quiet. A person at the edge of things, looking for the particular shelter of a room that was designed for them. She thought about her grandmother at the kitchen table with graph paper and pencil. She thought, it's going to be beautiful. She went to sleep. Outside, December rain ran in rivers down the windows of the house on Kensington Lane, and in the garden the cherry tree held its bare branches against the city sky, patient as it was every winter, knowing without knowing that the spring was always on the other side. The groundbreaking was on a Tuesday in February, on a morning so cold it turned every breath visible. Sarah had not planned it as an event. She had thought of it as a working moment. Her, Audrey, Francis, the lead contractor, a few signatures, a shovel in the ground for the photographs Audrey said they needed for the planning file. But it had grown the way things grow when other people are involved, because Arthur had said he'd like to attend, and because Francis had mentioned it to the local councillor who had been supporting the planning application, and because the councillor had mentioned it to the community liaison who had asked whether they might hold a small gathering for residents of the eastern side. By the time the morning arrived, there were 40 people standing on 12 acres of flat February ground in the cold, and Sarah was standing at the edge of them with a shovel and a look on her face that she was aware, from the inside, was different from the way her face usually looked. She was not nervous. She had been nervous before other things, the preliminary hearing, the call to grace in the garden that first morning. She was not nervous now. What she was feeling was something without a good name, a fullness that arrived in the chest when the thing you have been building in your mind for a very long time becomes, in a single morning, physical. Damien was there. She had not asked him to be there, but she had told him the details and the time and the address, and he had driven her himself, which he did without making anything of it, and stood now slightly to her left with his hands in his coat pockets in the particular way of a person who was choosing to take up exactly the right amount of space. Grace was there. She stood beside Francis, who she had met the week before, and the two of them had apparently found immediate common ground in the territory of very precise women, who did not waste words, because they were already talking with the ease of people who have known each other longer than they have. Audrey spoke briefly. The councillor spoke briefly. Sarah spoke. 3 sentences, which was 2 more than she had wanted, but 1 fewer than the councillor had hoped for. And what she said was, "My grandmother designed this building on graph paper 40 years ago. It was designed for this community, and for the light that comes from the east in the morning. Today we begin." Then she put the shovel in the ground. The cold earth gave slowly. She pushed. The earth came up. The 40 people applauded. She stepped back. She looked at what she had done. 1 shovel width of ground turned, the raw dark earth visible, and she thought it was strange how small the action was and how large the meaning, and she held both in her chest at the same time without trying to resolve the strangeness, because the strangeness was the point. Photographs were taken. She was in some of them and out of others. Damien appeared in 3 of them, which she did not notice until she saw the photographs later, and in each one he was exactly the same, present, not performing, looking at her rather than at the camera with an expression that was not a performance either. After the photographs, people moved to a tent that Audrey had arranged, which had tea and pastries and the particular warmth of 40 people in a small space on a cold morning. Sarah moved through the tent the way she moved through rooms, attending to the person in front of her completely, remembering names, asking the right questions. She met 3 residents of the eastern side who had brought their children, who had heard about the clinic and the library and who asked, with the direct practicality of people who have needed things and not always found them, how long it would take and what hours it would operate. She told them what she knew and what she didn't. She said the building was expected to be complete in 18 to 24 months. She said the library would be open 6 days a week. She said the clinic was in partnership discussions with the Community Health Trust, which would determine the specific services, but the intent was primary care and women's health and children's services. She said the market would operate on a reduced rent model for local traders, with the community trust overseeing applications. One of the women, practical, direct, her daughter tugging at her coat throughout, said, "Your grandmother thought this up?" Sarah said, "Yes." The woman said, "Good woman." Sarah said, "She was." She found Arthur near the tea table and thanked him. He said the due diligence had been the easiest he'd run in years, which she took as the compliment he intended, and responded to by asking 3 specific questions about the drawdown schedule that he answered with visible appreciation. She found Francis at the edge of the tent, looking at the site through the gap in the canvas with the expression of someone composing a room. She said, "What are you thinking?" Francis said, "I'm thinking about the entrance. The original plans have a straightforward entrance lobby. I think there's an opportunity to make it better. A small indoor garden space, between the exterior and the main library entrance. Plants. Somewhere to stop between outside and inside. Sarah said, add it to the revision notes. Francis said, I already have. Grace appeared at Sarah's elbow. She said, there's a journalist here, from the local paper. She wants to do a piece on the project. Sarah said, all right, after the tent. The journalist was a young woman named Lucy who had a recorder, and the slightly apologetic efficiency of someone who has learned that people are more comfortable when you move fast. She asked Sarah about the project in the straightforward way of a person who has done her research and doesn't need to be told the basics, and Sarah answered with the same efficiency. And then Lucy said, this started because of a legal dispute, is that right? Over the land title? Sarah said, yes. Lucy said, can you tell me anything about that? Sarah said, the land is mine. The title is clean. The building is going up. That's the story. Lucy said, and the family connection? You're married to... Sarah said, I'm married to Damien Cole. He's not part of this project in any official capacity. He's here today because he's my husband and I invited him. Lucy looked at her recorder. Then she looked up and said, fair enough. She wrote it that way. When the piece appeared, it was brief and accurate and focused on the building and on Patience Adayez's original plans, which Sarah had allowed her to photograph, and which appeared in the article in black and white, the pencil lines visible, the handwriting clear. The headline read, Granddaughter builds what grandmother planned. Sarah read it online at the kitchen island with her morning coffee. Henry read it on his phone while he was making breakfast. He did not say anything, but he put the coffee in front of her at exactly the right moment, the way he always did, and she thought that was its own kind of comment. The article was shared widely within the Eastern Side community, and then beyond it. She received 7 messages that day from people she did not know, which increased to 14 the next day, and then settled into a steady trickle that continued for weeks. Several were from people whose families had known her grandmother. Several were from women who had been waiting for the clinic. One was from a man who ran a food stall at a farmer's market and was looking for a permanent site for his business. She replied to each one. She kept a folder on her laptop with the messages organized by type, clinic enquiries to the health trust liaison, market trader interest to a separate spreadsheet that was growing faster than she had expected, community feedback to a folder she would return to when the design revision was being finalized. She did not do this because someone had asked her to. She did it because it was the right way to manage a building that was being built for people, which meant the people were part of the building before the building existed, and that meant they deserved a response. Damien watched this happening from close range and said nothing about it until a Thursday evening, when he came into the study, and she was midway through a response to a woman who had sent a 3-paragraph message about what it would mean to her family to have primary care available within walking distance, and he read the message over her shoulder. She let him, without moving, and then he said, I want to be more involved in this. She looked at him. He said, not as a financial backer, not as an introducer of people. I want to be involved in the actual project, if you'd want that. She said, in what capacity? He said, I've done development projects for years. I know contractors. I know how builds go wrong. I know how to manage the things that go wrong. I could be useful on the operational side. She said, it would mean working with me. He said, I know. She said, in detail, on the specifics, on the things that go wrong. He said, I know that too. She said, there's a contractor question I've been holding for 3 weeks. The groundwork estimate came in significantly over budget. I've been thinking about how to handle it. He said, show me. She pulled up the spreadsheet. He sat in the chair across the desk, her desk, which had become their desk in this context, the same way the kitchen island had become their island. And he looked at the figures and asked 4 questions, and identified the component in the estimate that was inflated, and suggested 2 alternatives, one of which she had already considered, and one of which she hadn't. She said, the second option is better. He said, I think so too. She said, call them on Monday. He said, do you want me to make the call or do you want to make it? She said, you make it. You know the language. He said, all right. He made the call on Monday. The revised estimate came back on Wednesday, considerably improved. He forwarded it to her with a 1-line message, sorted. She forwarded it to the project file. This became their working pattern. She managed the community side, the design process, the financial structure, the responses and the relationships and the vision. He managed the operational side, the contractors, the timelines, the inevitable complications of a build. They overlapped in the middle, which was where the interesting questions lived, and in the overlap they worked well together in the specific way that two precise and direct people work well together when they have stopped trying to establish who is in charge. She had not appointed him. He had not appointed himself. It had happened the way the kitchen had happened, the way the garden and the hedge and the tea had happened. Through repetition, through showing up, through being useful and consistent and not making a thing of any of it. He was, she had concluded over months, the kind of man who became what a situation needed, not to please the situation but because he understood that being useful was its own reward. She had not expected this from him. She expected very little from him in the beginning, which was the right position given what the beginning had been, and he had built on top of that expectation with consistency and time and the occasional spreadsheet. In March, 4 months after the groundbreaking, the build began in earnest. She stood at the site on the morning the concrete was poured for the foundations and watched it happen. The trucks, the workers, the slow, careful spread of gray across the footprint her grandmother had measured on graph paper. And she thought about beginnings, about what it meant to begin something that someone else had already imagined, to be the person who picked up the line of a story from the point where another person had left it. She thought about her grandmother's hands on the graph paper. She thought about the pencil lines and the measurements and the reading room with its eastern windows. She thought, I'm carrying it forward. She thought, that's what you do, for the people who came before you. You carry it forward as far as you can, and then you give it to the next person. The concrete was poured. The site workers moved with the efficient, purposeful rhythm of people doing a job they knew how to do. The city skyline was visible in the distance. The morning was cold and clear. Damien stood beside her, not saying anything, which was exactly right. She looked at the gray foundation taking shape in the earth and she thought about what would stand there, the rooms, the light, the people who would move through them. The woman who had never come in from the market on Merton Road without stopping to let Sarah feel the weight of the paper bags. She said, not quite to him. She would love this. He said not quite to her. I think so. They stood on the land while the concrete was poured, in the cold March morning, and the city went on around them and the foundation took shape and everything that came before, and everything that would come after was briefly, at this moment, held in the same place. She stayed until the pour was finished. Then she went back to work. The months of the build had their own rhythm, which was different from the rhythm of the months before. Before, she had been working in a kind of controlled urgency, the legal structure, the filing, the waiting, the watching, everything precise and contained, the stakes visible every day. Now the build was underway and the urgency was dispersed across the weeks in a different way, showing up as contractor meetings and revised estimates and planning consultations and Francis's careful design revisions and the slow, tangible accumulation of a building on a site where before there had been only grass. She visited the site every Tuesday and Thursday. Damien came with her on Thursdays. Francis came on whichever day suited her, which was usually Monday, and she walked the emerging structure with a tape measure and an expression of deep attention, asking questions of the site manager, that the site manager answered with the respect one professional gives to another, who clearly knows what they're talking about. The entrance lobby was under discussion. Francis had included the indoor garden space in the revised plans, a glass roof, plants, a bench, and Sarah had approved it without reservation. During one Thursday visit, Damien stood in the space where it would be, looked up at where the glass roof would go and said, "You'll need to think about what plants can handle direct light from above without becoming difficult to maintain." Francis, who had come that week for reasons she described as instinct, said, "I have a list." He said, "Of course you do." Francis said, "Have you met Sarah's grandmother?" He said, "She died before I knew Sarah." Francis said, "A shame. I think you'd have got on." He looked at her. She looked at him. Then she turned back to the entrance space and resumed thinking about plants. The market traders were a separate project that ran parallel to the build, which Sarah had not initially anticipated being quite so significant. The market liaison spreadsheet had grown to 47 names by April, from the man with the food stall, to a woman who made ceramics, to a man who had run a fruit and vegetable stall for 20 years, and whose pitch was based purely on continuity. "I've done it before, I'll do it well. I just need a permanent site." She was not the one to make the selection. She had established a small community trust to manage the market applications, with 3 residents of the eastern side, and the local councillor, and a trader from a neighboring market who knew the specifics. She provided the brief. They provided the selections. But she was consulted, and she consulted carefully, and she found that the market project, which she had thought of as the smallest component of the building, was the one that most people in the community understood immediately and viscerally. The clinic was important, the library was important. But the market was the place people could immediately picture themselves in, on a Saturday morning, buying vegetables or a ceramic bowl. And it was the place they talked about first when they talked about what the building meant. She thought about her grandmother's Merton Road market and the paper bags and what had stayed with her from all those visits. She thought, of course. Of course the market is what people understand. It's the place where daily life is made. In May, the building's walls were going up. She stood in the reading room space on a Thursday, the eastern wall not yet finished, open to the morning sky, and she could see exactly where the windows would be and how the light would fall through them. She stood in the place where a chair might go, in the corner by what would be the window, and she thought, someone will sit here, someone who needs to be somewhere quiet, someone at the edge of things. She thought about her grandmother's phrase, designing from the inside of use. She thought about a young woman at this window on a winter morning, with a book she has been meaning to read, in a room that was designed to hold her. She stood there for a while. Behind her she heard Damien come in through the gap where the door would be. He came and stood beside her, in the same open space, looking at the same open wall. He said, "It's going to be good." She said, "Yes." He said, "How does it feel, being here?" She said, "Like finishing a sentence that someone else started." He thought about that. He said, "Or like being the second half of a sentence." She said, "Yes, that's better." He said, "Your grandmother would have put it exactly right." She said, "She would have said something like, 'We're getting somewhere at last.'" He said, "Is that something she would say?" Sarah said, "It's something she said to me once when I was learning to sew. I'd been struggling with a seam for an hour and I got it right and she said it. Just that. We're getting somewhere at last." He said, "I think she'd say it about this." She said, "I think so too." June arrived and with it an invitation she had been expecting and had spent several weeks deciding how to approach. Celestine sent a note. Not a card this time. A note, on plain white paper, in the same large handwriting, requesting whether Sarah would be willing to meet for coffee. Just coffee. No formal setting. A place of Sarah's choosing. She showed the note to Damien. He read it. He handed it back. He said, "Do you want to?" She said, "I don't know yet." He said, "You don't have to." She said, "I know." She thought about it for 4 days. She thought about what had been done and what had been resolved, and what remained unresolved, and whether having coffee with Celestine Cole was a thing she was willing to do. On the 4th day she thought about the second card Celestine had sent, the one that said, "I recognize that I have made decisions that caused harm. I am not accustomed to saying that." She thought about what it cost a person of Celestine's kind to say that. Not much, perhaps. Celestine was sophisticated enough to know when a strategic acknowledgement was more useful than continued resistance, but not nothing either. She thought about her grandmother, not about the land or the refusals or the letters, about who she had been, about the kind of woman who held things without bitterness, who fought without spending herself on the fight, who kept the fighting separate from the living. She texted Celestine, "Coffee Wednesday. There's a place called the Aldridge on Fletcher Street, 10 o'clock. Celestine replied within minutes, "Thank you." She went on Wednesday. Celestine was already there when she arrived, which was different from the visit to the sitting room. No arrival for effect, no establishing of position. She was simply there, in a coat, with her hands around a coffee cup, looking slightly different from how she looked at the dinner table, smaller, or perhaps more exact. Without the room around her, she was just a woman in a coat having coffee. Sarah sat down. She ordered tea. Celestine said, "Thank you for coming." Sarah said, "Yes." Celestine looked at her. She said, "I've been following the building project, the article in the local paper." Sarah said, "It's going well." Celestine said, "The plans your grandmother made, the journalist described them. They sound—" She stopped. She said, "I would like to see them, someday, if that was ever something you were willing to share." Sarah looked at her for a moment. She said, "Perhaps when the building is finished." Celestine nodded. She did not push. She held her coffee cup with both hands and she looked at Sarah with an expression Sarah had not seen before on her face. Not the managed warmth, not the social performance, not the calculation. Something closer to acknowledgement. She said, "You're better at this than I expected." Sarah said, "I had good teachers." Celestine said, "Your grandmother." Sarah said, "Yes." Celestine said, "And?" Sarah said, "Attention. It turns out that's most of it. Just paying attention." Celestine was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I thought I was paying attention. I thought I was doing what needed to be done." Sarah said, "I know you did." Celestine said, It wasn't personal, not to you. Sarah said, I know that too. That's not the same as it being acceptable. Celestine looked at her hands. She said, no. They sat with that. Then Celestine said, Damien is different, since this year. Sarah said, yes. Celestine said, I know it's because of you. Sarah said, it's because of him. He made the choices. Celestine said, perhaps. She did not say it with certainty, and Sarah did not pursue it. She thought, it will take her time to understand that about him. She might not understand it fully. That was her problem to carry. They finished their coffee and their tea. They left the Aldridge and stood briefly on Fletcher Street, the June morning around them, the city bright and going about its day. Celestine said, I hope the building is everything your grandmother imagined. Sarah said, it will be. Celestine nodded. She turned and walked away. Sarah stood on Fletcher Street for a moment. She thought about what that conversation had been. Not reconciliation, not closure. Something more preliminary than both of those things. The first conversation that had been honest in both directions. The beginning of something she didn't have a name for and wasn't going to give one to prematurely. She walked to the bus stop. She went home. She went to the study and sat at the desk and opened the grocery notebook. She looked through the entries from the beginning. The word possible, the list, the crossings out, direction, 3 generations plus 1, I'm staying. She turned to the last blank page. She wrote, coffee with Celestine, something beginning. She thought for a moment. Then she added, the walls are up. Both things were true. Both things were connected, in the way that things are connected when they happen in the same year, in the same life, in the same act of a person deciding who they are going to be. She closed the notebook. She went to the kitchen and made lunch for 2, because Damien was working from home, and it was lunchtime, and the ordinary rhythm of the household moved through her hands as she worked. The familiar reach, the familiar sounds, the particular way the light came through the window at this hour. She thought, this is what my grandmother called getting somewhere. She thought, yes, we are. The building opened on a Thursday in October, 2 years after the groundbreaking. Not exactly 2 years, 22 months and 14 days, which was 4 weeks ahead of the original schedule, a fact the contractor mentioned at the handover meeting with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has managed to build well, and knows it, and does not need to oversell the knowledge. Sarah signed the final completion certificate at the site manager's table, in the courtyard between the clinic wing and the market entrance, with the building standing around her, finished, real, in the particular October light that came from the east in the mornings. She had seen it in every stage of its becoming. She had been there when the foundations were poured and when the walls went up and when the glass roof went in over the entrance lobby garden, where Francis's plants were now 3 months established and had the easy confidence of things that have been correctly placed. She had been there for the wiring and the fitting out and the day the library shelving arrived on 2 trucks, flat-packed, which she and Damien and 4 volunteers had assembled over a Saturday that she considered one of the better Saturdays she had had in recent memory. She had seen it become itself, but the first morning it opened she arrived before the staff did, before the market traders had set up their stalls, before anyone else was there, and she walked through it alone. She started in the entrance lobby. The plants were good, a selection Francis had described as forgiving but interesting, which Sarah had noted was how Francis described most things she approved of. The bench was the kind you could actually sit on. The light from the glass roof came down clean and even. She went to the library, the reading room with its eastern windows. She stood in the corner she had stood in when there were no walls yet, when she had thought, someone will sit here. She stood in the corner now, with the shelves full and the chairs in place and the light coming through the eastern windows, exactly as her grandmother had intended, and she was unable to say anything, even to herself, because there are moments that are too large for the interior monologue, and this was one of them. She stood there for a while, then she went to the clinic wing. The examination rooms were exactly as the plans had specified, large enough to be dignified, with good light and good ventilation, and the kind of plain, unhurried design that makes a person feel attended to rather than processed. The Health Trust had confirmed the services 6 months ago: primary care, women's health, children's services, and a community nurse. The first appointments were already booked. She went to the market. The stalls were set up, the traders had been given access the previous day to arrange their setups, and some had clearly been there late, because the stalls were ready and exact in a way that only happens when someone has done it before and cares about the result. The man with the food stall had set up in the position she had designated for him, which was the stall that caught the morning light from the south. She stood at his stall and looked at the arrangement and thought about what it would look like in 2 hours with people in it. She went back to the entrance lobby and sat on the bench. She thought about her grandmother. She thought about a kitchen table on Merton Road and graph paper and pencil, and a woman sitting in the particular quality of evening light, measuring rooms for the morning. She thought about 40 years of holding land and refusing offers and writing letters, and what it cost to hold something for that long with nothing but intention and patience. She thought about what it meant to give a thing to someone before you were finished with it. Not finished with the wanting of it. Her grandmother had wanted to build this until the end, but finished in the sense of running out of the years to do it, handing it on because the years had come to their end, and the person who came after was now going to have to carry it forward. She thought, she trusted me with it. She thought, I know. She sat on the bench in the entrance lobby of the building her grandmother had planned, and she let that be exactly what it was, which was large and full and complicated and entirely hers. People began to arrive at 9. The market traders first, the ceramic artist with her display cases, the man with the fruit and vegetables who had done it for 20 years and was doing it again now. 3 food stalls and a woman who sold hand-bound notebooks and a man who made candles who had added a last-minute request for a stall that Sarah had accommodated because the candles were very good. Then the staff, the library manager, a woman named B who had been appointed 3 months ago, and who had spent those 3 months preparing the collection and training the 2 part-time staff with the precise dedication of someone who understands that a good library is a specific thing, not just a room with books in it. The clinic nurses and the administrator, Audrey, who came as a guest but who walked through every room with the expression of someone checking her own work. Then the community. The woman from the groundbreaking who had asked what hours the clinic would operate, with her daughter who was 2 years older now and more interested in the market stalls than in adults. 43 appointment letters had gone out for the clinic's first week. The library had received 83 membership registrations in the month since registration opened. She moved through the morning the way she moved through any room, attending to the person in front of her, remembering names, asking the right questions. She talked to a man who had come specifically to see the reading room, who said he worked nights and had been looking for somewhere to spend his mornings. She talked to 3 women who came together, from a community group she had not previously known about, who were interested in holding their weekly meeting in the library's meeting room. She talked to the young woman who had taken the 3rd market stall, ceramics as she had said, but also silverwork, and her pieces were small and exact and the quality of someone who had been working at it for years without a permanent place to work from. Grace arrived at 11. She walked straight to Sarah and stood beside her for a moment, looking at the room, before she said anything. Then she said, "Your grandmother would lose her mind." Sarah said, "In the best way." Grace said, "In entirely the best way." They stood together for a moment, then Grace said, "I need to tell you something." Sarah looked at her. Grace said, "I've been approached by a firm, an expansion opportunity, another city. It would mean leaving here." Sarah said, "Are you going?" Grace said, "I haven't decided. I wanted to tell you." Sarah said, "You should go if it's right for you." Grace said, "I know, but you're here." Sarah said, "I'll be here wherever you are. That's how this works." Grace looked at her. Then she said, "Yes, I know." They hugged, briefly, in the middle of the entrance lobby, with the market behind them and the library ahead and the morning light coming through the glass roof onto the plants that Francis had chosen for exactly this. Damien arrived at noon. She saw him come through the entrance. He stopped in the lobby and looked up at the glass roof, then around at the plants, then through the opening toward the library. She watched him from across the room as he took it in, and she saw the particular attention on his face that she had come to know as his real face, the face he had when he was not managing anything. He saw her. He came over. He said, "It's remarkable." She said, "Yes." He said, "The entrance is exactly right, the plants." She said, "Francis." He said, "Francis." He looked around again. He said, "People are happy." She said, "Yes." He said, "That's the thing, isn't it? You can feel it." She said, "That's what she was designing for." He said, "I know." He stood beside her. They looked at the room together. The morning coming through the glass, the people moving through it, the market stalls in the distance, the sound of a place that is doing the thing it was built to do. He said, "I want to tell you something." She said, "Yes." He said, "I've been thinking about the South Side development, what it is and what it isn't, the things it does well." He paused. He said, "It makes money. It's well built. People will live in it, but it doesn't do this." She said, "It doesn't have to do this. They're different things." He said, "I know, but I want to do more of this. Eventually. I want to build things that are for people in the way this is for people. I don't know yet what that looks like exactly." She said, You'll figure it out. He said, probably with your help. She said, probably. He looked at her. She looked back. The room was full of people and sound and the ordinary, extraordinary fact of a building that was open and doing what it had been designed to do, and between them was 2 years of work, and 1 year before that of something harder to name, and in the middle of it all was the particular way they had of standing near each other, which was close enough that it was clear what it was, and far enough apart that it was also clear they were both still themselves. He said, I love you. He said it the way he said things that mattered, without performance, without build-up, as if it were simply true and there was no reason not to say it. She looked at him. She said, I know. He said, that's not an answer. She said, no. He waited. She said, I love you too. She said it the same way, simply, as if it were true. Because it was. It had become true, the way things become true, when you pay enough attention to them for long enough, when you stop explaining and just look. He said, all right. She said, all right. They turned back to the room, where the market was busy, and the library had a steady stream of people moving in and out of it, and the clinic was seeing its first morning of appointments, and the entrance lobby was full of people stopping to sit on the bench and look up at the glass roof and breathe. Her father arrived at 2. He came in slowly, the way he had been moving since everything that happened, careful, as if each step was a choice. He had given his statement in the full legal record 6 months ago. The record was on file. What came after that had been gradual and real and not finished, which was the right way for something like this to be. He came in through the entrance lobby. He stopped. He looked around. She went to him. He said nothing when she reached him. He looked at the room and then at her, and he had the face of a man who has spent a long time carrying something and has arrived at the place where the carrying was for. He said, this is everything she wanted. She said, yes. He said, I should have helped you build it. She said, you got here. He said, Sarah. She said, Dad. You got here. That's what matters right now. He looked at her. He was trying very hard not to make a scene in a room full of people, which she could see, and she thought, he really is trying. She said, come see the library. She took him through. She showed him the reading room, the eastern windows, the light, the corner where the chair was placed. She showed him the clinic and the market stalls and Francis's entrance garden. He looked at all of it in the particular way of someone assembling something they will need to remember. At the entrance to the library, he stopped in front of something she had put on the wall, a framed copy of her grandmother's original plans, the graph paper, the pencil lines, the handwriting, clean titled and properly preserved, the kind of display that would last. He stood in front of it for a long time. He said, she never showed me these. Sarah said, she knew you'd say they were impractical. He said, I would have. She said, I know. He was quiet. He looked at the plans, the handwriting, the measurements, the reading room with its windows facing east. He said, she knew, didn't she, what she was leaving you? Sarah said, she always knew. He said, so did you. She said, I had to learn it. He turned from the plans and looked at her. He said, I'm going to spend the rest of my time making this right. She said, I know. She meant both halves of that she believed him, and that she knew what the rest of his time would hold. Both things were true simultaneously, the way most things that mattered were. She said, come and meet Damien properly. He said, yes. She brought him across the room. She introduced them, simply, without ceremony. Damien shook her father's hand and said, it's good to finally meet you properly, which was exactly the right thing because it left the word finally to do what it needed to do and moved on. The afternoon continued. The market was still busy at 4. The library was quiet and full at the same time, the particular atmosphere of a good library where people are absorbed and not absorbed in the same room. The clinic finished its last appointment at 5 and the administrator came to find Sarah and said, first day without a cancellation. Sarah said, good. She stood in the entrance lobby at 5:30, after most of the day's visitors had gone, with Damien and Grace and Francis and Audrey and Henry, who had come on his day off in his own coat, with his own small contribution of pastries left over from a catering event he had done the day before, which he had brought because bringing things was how he expressed things. They stood in the entrance lobby with the day's energy still in the room, the particular warmth of a space that has been full of people and is now resting, and she looked at all of them, these people who had been part of different chapters of the same story, and she thought about her grandmother, who was not here and was everywhere. She said, thank you. She said it once. She did not say what for. They all knew. Outside, The October light was going. The city was settling into its evening. The eastern side of the city had a building now where before there had been grass, and the building had a library and a clinic and a market and an entrance lobby with plants under a glass roof, and a bench where a person could stop between outside and inside. She locked up. She stood outside on the street for a moment and looked at the building. Its clean lines, its windows, the entrance lobby visible through the glass, the plants still catching the last of the light. She thought about 40 years. She thought about the pencil on the graph paper. She thought about what her grandmother had held and what it had cost to hold it and what she had held it for. She thought, I know what it was for now. She turned and walked to where Damien was waiting. He had brought the car. He held the door and she got in, and the city moved past the windows on the drive home, and the house on Kensington Lane was lit up when they arrived, because Henry had left the lights on, the way he always did, so they would never come home to dark. She stood in the entrance hall. She listened to the house. It was, she thought, the best thing she knew, the sound of a house that is yours and is waiting for you, that has been yours through everything and will continue to be, that has absorbed the shape of your living so completely that it does not need to ask where you have been. She went in. She made tea. She stood at the kitchen window and looked at the garden, the cherry tree and its bare October branches, the hedge they had cut together on a Saturday, the bench under the tree where she had sat on a gray April morning a long time ago, holding a cold cup of coffee and beginning to understand what she was going to have to do. She had done it. She drank her tea. She thought about tomorrow, which was the second day the building would be open, and the day after that, and all the days after that in which people would move through those rooms and use what her grandmother had designed for them, in the morning light through the eastern windows, in the dignified clinic rooms, at the market stalls where daily life would be made and remade. She thought, keep going. She thought, always.